You're headlong down the runaway train that is the Anomic Age, and I am your host, John H. Happy to be back with you once again in the not-so-wee hours of the PM. AnomicAge.com is where you can find all things me. Please like all the likes, subscribe to all the subscriptions. If you're looking at the homepage there now, you'll see that our guest is none other than Mr. Michael Williams. He'll be getting to all things Beatlemania, Tavistock Institute, and culture creation. But before we get into that, please check out AnomicAge.com, like all the likes, subscribe to all the subscriptions, share those links, friends, family, loved ones, and enemies. iPhone app, Android app, free newsletter, subscribe by email, link. So much there, right there on the homepage of AnomicAge.com. If you can't handle the full 1-hour edition with guests, I recommend the information breakdown segments. They're only about 30 minutes, and they cover a variety of topics. So, without further ado, Mike Williams is a critical thinker and host of the popular internet site Sage of Quay. That's going to be sageofquay.com, Quay.com, Sage of Quay. He is also the founder of his long-running alternative news blog, Sage of Quay. Mike's content is dedicated to awakening the masses to help bring humanity back into our national existence of living in truth and serving creation. Thank you so much, Mike, for being with us today, sir. It's a pleasure. I'm happy to have you on.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you for asking me to come on your show.
Oh, it's definitely wonderful to have you on. And, you know, I was talking with a guest a few weeks back who sort of mentioned your name, and I'd already found you by searching his name. So Jay Widener, he was on a long time ago, and I found your content with him. And beautiful how these things work out sometimes.
Yeah, there's that synchronicity thing, right?
Indeed, the synchronicity, absolutely. Well, there's so much to get into with your research with the Beatles, and it connects into what I've kind of done a lot of shows about in the past, I'd say few weeks, but honestly few years. I've sort of come back to this notion of culture creation and how much of our quote-unquote culture is legitimate grassroots. This just happened sort of natural thing, but the more you sort of start picking at this thing and looking into these various avenues, the more, unfortunately, you find that so much of this has been contrived, manipulated, or at least somewhat controlled by something. And the Beatles, I think, being one of those big ones that is such an iconic band. So many musicians from various genres will point back to them as saying that was so influential, and this album and that album and so forth. So I understand why so many folks have this resonance towards, I'd hate to go there, you know, but in that quest for the truth, I think we got to go there.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow, John, for so many folks, especially people that are my age. We grew up with the Beatles. And so for most of my life, I was a Beatle fanatic. And it was because of the Beatles that I got into music. I learned to play guitar, write songs, record, and all that stuff. So in 2016, when I came upon a book titled The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which was published, well, the first edition was published back in 2009, and I read that book, I was having a difficult time getting my head wrapped around what the book was saying. And you know, it had a number of threads going through the book. The first one primarily being that biological Paul McCartney, the guy that we knew between 1962 and 1966, was replaced in late 1966. The book states that he actually passed away on September 11th of 66. And he was swapped out with Billy Shears. Mm-hmm. And I refer to him as Billy Shears because that's the name he gives us. He introduces us to himself on the Sgt. Pepper album. Even though Ringo sings the song is actually introducing the new band member to the world. So we had that piece of it where we had Paul McCartney, biological Paul, being swapped out, but then we have this whole other thread, John, which is what you touched on in the intro, which is that the Beatles were a monstrous social engineering initiative, and they were created in a construct of Tavistock. And so that was the piece that really looms larger and larger as you get into the conspiracy. In fact, I stopped calling it the Paul is dead conspiracy. Going back a number of years ago, I went to the McCartney conspiracy, and then it's the Beatles conspiracy, because the whole swapping out of biological Paul McCartney at the end of the day is just a subset.
Yeah, just a
It's
piece
a
of the puzzle.
sidebar piece of the puzzle. Exactly. And so there's a much larger play at hand that is very important for people to understand, because it's as you mentioned, they are, when I say they, we're talking about the controllers, we're talking about Tavistock, the Committee of 300, the Rockefeller Foundation, all of them, Bilderberg, Trilateral, Davos. They are knee deep in transforming our culture and our society. And the stake I put in the ground, John, is 1960, because it's a nice round number.
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell folks is, for the last 6 decades, there has been a very methodical and incremental march toward a new world, or a one world agenda. And I would argue, and I'm sure you would too, that it's no longer a slow march today.
No.
Now, I mean, they have picked up the pace. They've put the pedal to the metal, and they're looking to make change very, very quickly. But for the first 60 years, up through around 2020, then March 2020, we have the event. That's where the pace really, really picked up. So, yeah, it's all about the transformation of culture. And as you mentioned, very little of the culture that we exist in and we interact in on a daily basis is organic, because they have created so much of what's all around us and what it is that we're plugged into, that it's their system that we're operating in, and their system is loaded up with deception.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's funny that you put that demarcation at 1960, because that's pretty much where I put it as well, and I'm sure other people also. But so much happened between that point and where we are today. I mean, I've done shows on this stuff where you look at the no-fault divorce laws, introduction of the pill, drugs, legitimization of drug culture, Watergate, what am I leaving out? Abortion.
Yeah.
Another undeclared war with Vietnam rolls us into the Middle East. And I mean, we could just keep checking these boxes off. But so much of that was out of the culture that I would argue, and probably you as well, that was just created at 1960 from so on to where we are today. It was just, I mean, you look at the 50s, and there was a little bit of harbingers of things to come with Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Sun Records. But then you hit 1960, and it just sort of really goes downhill, snowball effect, if you will, to where we are today.
Yeah, because 1960 was the beginning of their age of Aquarius, or their their eon of Horus. And so that's when they buckled down, and they decided that it was going to be a straight march toward their goal line, which is to achieve their age of Aquarius, or their version of it, I should say, which is the eon of Horus. It's Aleister Crowley's eon of Horus. And all the things that you rattled off. And one of the most significant events, John, that took place goes back to the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, I left that
in
one out.
1963. That was a huge, huge turning point, especially with regard to the American psyche. Mm-hmm. Because at that point, when Kennedy was elected president, there was a lot of upbeat. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of people were filled with inspiration that things were really going to take off for the country. And then when Kennedy was assassinated, that was popping the bubble, a big bubble. And when you take a look at what's happened since the Kennedy assassination on November 22nd of 1963, as you mentioned, there's just a litany of events that have taken place. And these are all things that they control. We talk about, political events, military, medical, the education system. I mean, we could just go on and on and on. These are all part of the internationalist apparatus that controls the world. We used to call it the shadow government, the deep state. I mean, today they're front and center. They make no, they're not hiding anymore. We can see the World Economic Forum is out there front and center talking about all the things that they want to do. And so, yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get off on too much of a jag, but absolutely the trauma-based mind control. And I know Naomi Klein did a whole book, The Shock Doctrine. And I think for so many people, the shock and that trauma-based mind control kind of began with that JFK assassination and then rolled into RFK, MLK, and John Lennon and attempt on Reagan and 9/11. It just keeps on with more and more trauma. But for so many people, the images on the television screen in the JFK assassination really burned and seared into their psyches and really changed, like you said, a whole generation of people. I mean, my parents and grandparents, everyone in that generation always went back to that moment and said, well, that's kind of when it all changed. All thought, all trust in government, all legitimacy of anything was just sort of put into question with that one event.
Yeah, in fact, I remember I was only 4 years old in 1963, and I remember very clearly watching the television set. It's seared in my memory, some of the events that took place when it was televised. So I was only 4. So when we talk about how it can affect, how it's trauma-based, and it has a lingering effect, it definitely leaves an impression. And if I was only 4 and I remember it, then people who were much older than I was are going to have a much greater recollection of that day, and it could potentially have more of an impact to them emotionally and mentally going forward.
And then if you put these pieces together again, you're looking at JFK in 63, and then by 64, we're at the helm of what they term the British invasion, with the Rolling Stones, the Beatles being that cornerstone band of that, and many others to follow.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason why I brought the JFK piece into it is because it was a major event. That's number one.
Absolutely.
But number two, the Beatles were a logical step from a mind control perspective to go from the JFK assassination to this wonderful thing referred to as Beatlemania.
Escapism.
Right, escapism. So it took a country, because when the Beatles came to America on February 7th of 1964, it was referred to as the Beatles conquering America. Mm-hmm. Right? They pick and choose their words very, they have meaning. You just can't schlep it off and say, well, it doesn't mean anything. There's intention behind their words. And so when the Beatles arrived, it was right off the heels of the Kennedy assassination, and that's part of the perpetual state of trauma-based mind control and conditioning that takes place in the world.
Yes, no doubt. So a lot of the things that are sort of questioning or causes consternation to people when we talk about the Beatles is, they sort of just rose out of nowhere, seemingly. And a lot of people will draw those comparisons with the occult, rightfully so, as far as meeting at the crossroads, and you've heard of all these different bands and entertainers, I'll just say, selling their souls and all these sort of things. So I think that's one of the major sticking points with the Beatles is they seem to come out of nowhere. They didn't really pay their dues, I think, in a lot of people's eyes of working their way up from a small club to Shea Stadium. Is that accurate?
Well, a lot of people will say, based upon the official narrative, that, they paid their dues because they did Hamburg and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But you have to put it within context, John. They arrived to do their first gigs in Hamburg in August of 1960. They then landed in America, as I mentioned before, to conquer America on February 7th, 1964. That's only 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. So they went from obscurity in August of 1960 to a trajectory that was just amazing, to landing in America in February of 64. And if you go back and take a listen to, and this is what I do. I use mainstream information, interviews, and sources to show people that they're telling you, it's hidden in plain sight, but they are telling you how this really worked. So the Beatles, when they first started in August of 1960, per George Martin's own words, and George Martin was their producer and many times referred to as the fifth Beatle, that he thought their music was rubbish and he didn't see any songwriting abilities. Like he didn't see any songwriting acumen coming out of the Beatles, out of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And of course, at the time in 1962, when he met them and then ended up signing them, George Martin was a big-time producer, and he would know if he ran across a group or an artist that had ability, songwriting ability, and he didn't see it. So they went from being these young guys in Hamburg with no songwriting abilities, and also with marginal at best musical abilities as far as how good or how well versed they were on their instruments, again, to winding up with the start of Beatlemania in America, at least in February of '64. So you have to ask yourself, how did that trajectory happen? Was this organic? Did four guys that were bouncing around in Germany, who at the time were living in squalor and playing 7 or 8 hours a night? I mean, there's an interview by Pete Best where Pete says that they would be at the venue at 6 p.m. They would play for 7 or 8 hours. They would then go to sleep, and they would wake up at 3 p.m. in the afternoon and have to be back at the venue by 6 p.m. So that left a window of 3 hours between when they woke up and when they had to be back at the club in Hamburg. So the first question you've got to ask yourself is, who was writing music at that time? Nobody was writing music at that time. And in fact, the Beatles were just a group of four guys, young guys, that were doing what four young guys would normally do who were in a band away from home in Germany, in Hamburg, which, the area that they were in was really, it was like the red light district. There was a lot of prostitution. There were bars all over the place. So, they were in an environment where what wound up happening was the Beatles kind of embraced that environment as four young guys in a band.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't want to go there, or they don't know about that piece of the history, because when you talk about it that way, then it doesn't put them in this propped up, illuminated light in which most people see the Beatles, as these creative, prolific, genius songwriters, especially when we're talking about John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So there was a lot of stuff that went on, John, between August of 1960 to the time they made their way over to America in February of 1964. They did a Decca demo, January of 1962, and Decca declined to sign them. They weren't impressed. And then when George Martin first met them, tapes were given to him by Brian Epstein, and George Martin said, not interested, not going to sign them. And then in the Memoirs of Billy Shears, the book I mentioned earlier, it tells us that George Martin was overruled. In other words, he received a call from a superior, whether it be at EMI itself or within the corporate structure of Freemasonry, and said, look, you're going to take him on. And from that point on, George Martin, I refer to him as the managing director of the Beatles' psychological operation, this social engineering initiative, was responsible for making the Beatles what they became.
Yeah.
And that includes employing outside songwriters that were on the Tavistock /EMI payroll to write the songs. And also they hired session musicians to record the songs. So from 1962 through 1966, the Beatles, I will say, wrote very little, if anything. I lean toward nothing in that period, because all the songs were written by outside songwriters or ghostwriters, and the songs were recorded by session players. I have an interview. I'm working on a presentation as we speak. And there was an interview that John Lennon and Paul McCartney did back in August of 1966. And it was the same day that they released their seventh album, Revolver. And then in that interview, Paul McCartney states that they were limited as a group and not all that good musically. And so you have to ask yourself, at that point, when we're talking about Revolver in August of 1966, for one of the main songwriters of the greatest band, what many people consider to be the greatest rock band of all time, to state in an interview that they were limited as a group and not all that good musically, well, that flies in the face of the picture of what the official narrative wants to present to the public, that they were prolific geniuses, musical geniuses. So, it's one of those situations where you have to ask yourself, it was a truth bomb, yes. Was it revelation of the method? Possibly. So it's a very interesting story, John. When you get away from the official narrative and you start digging into what was really going on, it becomes very, very interesting.
And I think a lot of people don't want to view it through that lens. I think it goes back to sort of our belief that it all just happened. But if you look at the music industry as an industry, that's what it is. These big corporations want whoever the public view of it really doesn't matter. They want whoever the person that can sell their product the best. That's the bottom line. Whether they're selling candy bars or a song, they want that best face forward, and they'll sort of fill in the blanks with the musicians, the songwriters, the stage, the lights. It's all a show, folks. It really is all a show. And it's really the bottom line is money, but in this instance, I think it's sort of multifold. It's that Russian doll sort of one thing and the other, because it's not just money. It's about the control. It's about culture creation, the evolution of the counterculture that came out of the 1960s. It's so much rolled into this one thing. It's not just a grassroots thing. I mean, just to keep hitting that point home.
Yeah, well, the social scientists, they play on human emotions, right? Mm-hmm. And who doesn't like the official narrative's version of the Beatles story? Yeah. Organic, four lads from Liverpool. They connect with a record store owner. They get signed by a major label under the tutelage of George Martin, and they become this brilliant band, and they achieve unparalleled fame and fortune. It's a great story. I call it the Cinderella story. It's a great story. Who doesn't want to like that story? But this is what the social scientists at within Tavistock, within the controlling apparatus, this is what they do. They play on what they know people want to hear, how they want to feel. Mm-hmm. And then they present a narrative that matches up with what they know people will buy, what they will just absorb and take in. But to your point, and you're absolutely right, the music industry, the entertainment industry is a business. And not only is it a business, it is one of the most ruthless businesses to operate within, because everything is about money. Everything is about a product and getting the best product out the door. So it's naive for people to believe that these record companies are going to spend their time jerking around with a bunch of musicians and artists and bands that are not going to bang out as efficiently and as effectively as possible the product that the record company or the label needs to get out the door. It's just not going to happen. So what are they going to do? They're going to do what every company does. They're going to tap the best resources and skills to bring forth the best product. So they're going to tap their best songwriters, ghostwriters that they have on tap. They're going to bring in the best studio players that they can get their hands on to get these songs recorded and to get them as near to perfection as they possibly can. And I tell people, I try to explain to them, the Beatles were not an exception to the rule. They were not. This is how the music industry works. And what I recommend to folks is there are 3 documentaries that anybody who's interested in this particular conspiracy and the music industry in general and how it works is watch The Wrecking Crew. The Wrecking Crew were a collective of musicians that recorded on an enormous number of pop music recordings, albums and singles from the 1960s and 1970s, LA based, although they were also in New York and extended out to other areas of the country, but mostly LA based. Watch the Wrecking Crew documentary if you really want to understand how the music industry worked in the 1960s and 1970s, and you'll understand. Also, there's another documentary that came out in 2013 titled Muscle Shoals. And Muscle Shoals was doing the same thing that the Wrecking Crew was doing, but they were doing it in Alabama. And then if you really want to understand how the music industry works from 1980 going forward to current day, the documentary Hired Gun, I recommend. So those 3 documentaries, The Wrecking Crew, Muscle Shoals, and Hired Gun. And so it's another situation, John, where the documentaries themselves are revealing the truth about how it all works. And what always blows my mind is I have people that will take my suggestion and watch the documentaries and then say, yeah, but it doesn't apply to the Beatles or it doesn't apply to the Rolling Stones.
They've got sacred cows no matter what.
Yeah. So, and of course we have Bernard Purdie. Bernard is one of the greatest studio and session drummers of all time. He came out in the late 1970s and said that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs. He was hired by Brian Epstein to fix the tracks. And Bernard has not come off that story in over 45 years. In fact, he released a book. I think his book was released in 2014. It was titled Let the Drums Speak, and he dedicated an entire chapter to the Ringo Starr controversy or the Ringo Starr conspiracy, and it had to do with Bernard coming out and saying that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks. I had a source of mine who was related to, I say was because Ronnie Verrill passed away a number of years ago, to Ronnie Verrill, who was another great session drummer in the UK. And this person came forth and they wrote me. They had been writing me for a while. And after I released my big presentation in April of 2020, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? This person wrote me and said, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, my relative, Ronnie, also drummed on Beatles songs. So now we have Bernard Purdie and we have Ronnie Verrill drumming on Beatles songs. The official narrative tells us Andy White drummed on Beatles songs because George Martin, the producer, hired Andy to play on P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do on the 1962 recordings. And I've argued that I don't believe George Martin hired Andy White to drum on just 2 songs. I think Andy White was a go-to drummer that George Martin used whenever he was doing studio recordings. And Bernard Purdie ultimately came out in the early 2000s in an interview and said there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' music, and I believe Bernard was referring to the early period, 1962 to 1966. And said there were 4 drummers on the songs, and Ringo was not one of them.
Wow. So
there you go. So I'm just giving some folks some of the background, to what it is that I've gotten into and the stuff that I presented. But, like I said, it's a wild story. It really is.
One aspect I wanted to touch on, and I think it makes perfect sense to me anyway, is this sort of metamorphosis process that you see. I think I would say starting with the Beatles, but you see that through so much of music, whether or not you're talking the Beatles, Miley Cyrus, Michael Jackson, just about anybody big name in the music industry seems to go through this metamorphosis, especially the Disney people. But I mean, I'll put that aside for a moment, where they came out on Ed Sullivan. I remember they just came off this Hamburg red light district. So they were not the clean-cut boys. If you believe the narrative, they were not the clean-cut boys that they were put up on Ed Sullivan with their proper suits and hair and everything was just perfect. And then you juxtapose that 10 years down the road to the heavily influenced by psychedelics, heavily pushing the drug culture, all sorts of Indian influence, the beards, the longer hair, and they seem to have gone through this metamorphosis. Again, I'll say, just like you see so much of the big acts go through for generations now, multiple decades, we're seeing the same sort of trajectory. And I know some people are going to chalk it up, well, they grew older and they grew up and things changed, but it seems to be such a dichotomy of just polarization, like clean-cut boys to, yes, free love, free sex, let's do it all, maybe a little Satanism on the side,
Yeah. So a lot of people will say, well, they just evolved as it went along, but that's not what happened. Yes, there was an evolution, but it was not an organic evolution. The evolution of the Beatles and other bands and other artists and entertainers is determined by the social scientists. So in the case of the Beatles, it's Tavistock. So they had to start the Beatles at a certain point where they were going to be accepted by the culture and the society at that point in time. So they couldn't show up in 1967 psychedelic garb in 1962. Mm-hmm. They would just be set aside. Nobody would pay any attention to them. So the way the social engineering works is they start at a point where there's a broad or as broad of an acceptance as they can possibly muster up at that point in time. And then people get acclimated. And then you get bombarded and deluged with the music. And now what's happening is that evolution that we're talking about starts to get more and more traction. And so what happens is a little more change is introduced. And then people accept that. And then a little more. And then that's accepted. So it's that incremental, methodical approach to change. They're not just going to hit people over the head with a hammer and say, well, this is what we're going to do now. No, they know that people require a period of acclimation. The masses do. And that's how it's done. And they do it, like you said, John, pick an artist. Pick any artist that is front and center, that is popular in pop culture, and you will see that metamorphosis. You will see that change take place where they started at point A, and then if you go 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, or maybe 10 years down the line, if they have a longer shelf life, you see a very different artist than what you were looking at 5 to 10 years prior.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes they do what I just call, they burn their operatives. They put them in such a horrible situation or cast them in such a bad light. It sort of destroys their career or their trajectory. And either they fade into obscurity, or in 10 years they show up on a golden oldies tour of, they've resurrected them once again, and here they prop them up and they're back again. It seems to be that same sort of thing.
Well, I think what they do, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct, is they identify the usefulness or the shelf life of a particular artist, entertainer, or celebrity. And there are going to be those that are going to be long-term. Mm-hmm. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and so on. But then you're going to have the other categories of players, artists, and entertainers and celebrities that are not going to have that elongated shelf life. So they're going to serve a particular purpose at a particular time. And then once their usefulness has expired, they're tossed aside. Mm-hmm. That's why, a lot of them are just abused. They're abused through mind control. They're abused with alcohol and drugs. And this is why when we take a look at the music industry, just take a step back and think about all the stories of all of the bands and the artists that have suffered, where their lives were ended prematurely, or they had to dig themselves out of a drug-induced or alcohol-induced hole by going to rehab and all of this stuff. That industry is ripe with that dark stuff.
And sort of I would say perhaps the collateral damage of this is that it infuses that and normalizes it within the culture. So yes. Other upcoming musicians are going to say, well, hey, Jimi Hendrix died and Jim Morrison died. They all died these tragic young deaths. I got to go down the same road in order to produce that same vibrant music, which I don't know if all that's true, considering you got the Wrecking Crew, you got just probably other organizations we don't even know about. I've heard sort of similar accounts of Motown Records with Barry Gorey sort of having these same sound crews, basically just pushing these artists out there, creating that beautiful Temptations bass line and all these lyrics that we like so much.
Absolutely. So the artists are just the veneer. There's an entire machine that is behind the curtain to prop up the artists and that veneer. And the average person doesn't see what's behind the curtain. It's like trying to see if the Great Oz is behind the curtain. You pierce the veil. So most people, they don't do that. They just take it at face value. They believe the stories that are put out about how brilliant these songwriters are, these bands are, and all that stuff. And they have no idea how the industry really works. And you also, John, you hit on a good point, and you're right in the sense that what they do is they glorify a depraved way of existence, where sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We've all heard that. Sex and drugs and rock and roll. And so many young people buy into that because it's glorified, and they think it's cool, and they think it's a way in which to conduct yourself, and you're going to get ahead. When the truth of the matter is, it's just a way to break down society. It's just a way to dismantle the culture and societal values of a society that had traditional values, and looked at things in a much different way, in a much different light, going back to prior to 1960, because we put that stake in the ground. But that's what it's really all about. It's to implant in people's heads that that's okay when it's really not okay. But by you thinking it's okay, you're actually further enabling their agenda to destroy the culture and to destroy society. And so many people, they don't get it.
And with the Beatles especially, I know this occurred a little bit with Elvis also, and it went on throughout his career, but with the Beatles, it's the first time that I saw just this complete insanity with screaming people and people passing out. And I think it sort of followed that same trajectory I was talking about with the mob mentality or the groupthink. So once they see people do it, whether or not these are actors, paid for provocateurs, or legitimate, it becomes this trope of, okay, well, this is what you do. You show up and you scream and you pass out and you throw panties on the stage and act like a total nut. And now that's just the norm. But if you turn back the clock with the Beatles, that was kind of the first time we saw that. And then that ushered in that new age of contrived rock stars, provocateurs, paid screamers. I mean, whatever you want to call it, it does seem to have been a big change point there with just the crowd and the group thing.
Well, the Beatles, when it started with all of that screaming and the girls and all, that was contrived. It was a construct of Tavistock. In the very beginning, these girls were paid. They would bust in and they were paid to do all the screaming. And then what they did was they would use their trickery as far as their photography and their cameras, and they would shoot at certain angles and close the frame so it looked like there was a lot of people there. And, so they went through all of that. But Tavistock and the controlling apparatus, but in particular Tavistock, because this is their line of business, their understanding of the human mind goes beyond most people's level of comprehension. So they know that humans have this uncanny knack to follow, to mirror, to imitate. So to your point, when all of this screaming was taking place, Tavistock knew that, hey, in the beginning we have to seed this with some money. But in short order, we're not going to have to spend any money, because once we get the thing going, people are just going to behave that way because that's how the person next to them is behaving, or that is the way to behave when you're at a Beatles show or you're at some concert. That's the way that you're supposed to conduct yourself. And it's manipulation. It's manipulation of people's minds because, like I said, they know exactly how people are going to react once they're shown a certain behavior.
It's that old monkey see, monkey do thing. They start seeing this as, oh, well, that's what you do. I mean, it's the same cues that a baby picks up on from their parents and their greater social group. It's crazy.
Or it's just with any type of fad that even takes place, John, right? When we talk about clothing.
Yes.
All of a sudden clothing just shows up, a certain type of clothing. This happened to me when I was younger with the bell bottoms and the psychedelic stuff and all that stuff in the 1960s. Where did that stuff come from? Was that organic? No, it gets introduced through the media. And now what's happened is now you have an entire population of people, especially in Western culture, who are wearing bell bottoms and psychedelic types of clothing and wearing their hair longer, growing beards and mustaches and all that stuff. It's all contrived.
And with the Beatles, I think a lot of people look at them with the Eastern mysticism and the esoteric. But to your point and to your research, Paul McCartney being replaced could, and I would probably assume was, a bit of a ritual, a bit of a sacrifice, if you will, that you see, again, played out in so many different bands and groups over the decades. But I think that could be one of those first early sacrifices. Probably not on par with the halftime show this past year, but it was the 1960s more covert sacrifice.
Well, in the memoirs of Billy Shears, it strongly alludes to biological Paul McCartney. When I refer to biological Paul McCartney, this is the Paul McCartney from 1962 through 66. Of course, he was there before 62, but I'm talking about when the Beatles had hit their point where they were leading into fame and being famous. So that would be 62 through 66. It tells us that McCartney and John Lennon entered into a Faustian bargain in October of 1963. So a Faustian bargain is a deal with the devil.
Yeah.
Or as Bob Dylan would refer, it's a deal with the chief commander. And so what the controllers did, if that is true, and my personal opinion, Jay and I talked about this, these rituals take place. Okay, a lot of people don't want to hear it. They don't like to think about it. They want to pretend it doesn't happen. But there's a lot of dark stuff that happens in this reality, folks. And as I mentioned, the music industry and the entertainment industry itself is ruthless, and it is very dark. So, the Beatles were prepped leading into their first album, which was released on March 22nd, 322, Skull and Bones, also Genesis 322. Please Please Me was released, and they got a taste of fame and fortune. They got a taste for success. And then in October of that same year, 1963, that's when they entered into the deal. And what I try to explain to folks is, John Lennon and Paul McCartney at that time were two very young guys. Paul was 21 and I think John was 23. And they didn't know what they were getting into. But they went through whatever the ritual is comprised of, whatever the ceremony is, they went through it. And right after that, everything really took off. Then they released their second album with the Beatles on November 22nd of 1963. So think of the dates. March 22nd, Skull and Bones. Mm-hmm. And then November 22nd of 1963 was the exact day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Wow.
Okay? So the Beatles as an entity are immersed in the occult. And so it's very possible that biological Paul McCartney was his death, if we are to believe that he died in September of 1966, September 11th, was a result of entering into that Faustian bargain. So we can look to the 27 Club for people that are familiar with early deaths of rock stars and entertainers. But just take a look at some of the other bands during the Beatles' time. We have Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones passes away. Mm-hmm. We have Keith Moon of The Who passes away. John Bonham of Led Zeppelin passes away. And we can go on and on and on. So the whole bit about entering into these pacts with Satan, with Lucifer, with the devil, whatever label you want to give this entity, I believe these things are real, going to the crossroads. Mm-hmm. That's what it's referred to. So if we go back into the early part of the 1900s, we could look at Robert Johnson, who was a famous blues guitarist. And that's really when we talk about going to the crossroads, Robert Johnson is typically used as a starting point, even though I'm sure it wasn't. But from a music perspective, from a blues perspective, it goes back to the Robert Johnson story. But yet, so I believe the rituals, John, are real. And is it likely that John and Paul entered into some kind of pact? I would say that is also likely, because that's what takes place in the music industry and entertainment. You know, if you want to achieve real fame and fortune, I mean, you know, big time stuff, you're going to have to kiss the ring. And Bob Dylan, in his interview going back to, I think it was the early 2000s, with Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes, talks about the deal he made with the chief commander.
Yep.
Who do we think he was talking about? You know, so this stuff goes on, and it's dark. But, you know, I look at it this way, John. Some people don't want to hear it because it scares them. But knowledge is power. And the only way we're going to be able to dig ourselves out of this ditch that we're in worldwide is we have to have that knowledge base. We have to understand how the entities, the people, the organizations that are attempting to suppress humanity and keep us from being enlightened, you have to understand how they operate. What's their game plan? You know, so anyway, I know I went off a little bit on a
that's perfect
tangent there, but yeah.
And the Aleister Crowley information, I always found disturbing, because if you look at the history of Aleister Crowley and all the dark stuff he did, and then you sort of look at how did he play so prominently in the Beatles, in Led Zeppelin, and so many of these bands from that era, because even now he's an obscure figure that most people don't care about, haven't heard of. And I would say, especially if you look at the 1960s, I mean, there wasn't internet access. You couldn't just Google Aleister Crowley and figure this stuff out. I mean, he was a mystic from decades prior. How in the world did he play so prominently in so many of these bands if there wasn't, in fact, that occult influence, that occult connection? And then you got to look at the individuals in the bands. I mean, these folks were just, if you believe the narrative, just working class blokes from jolly old England. So how did they just happen to have all this bizarre esoteric knowledge, you know?
Right. So the thing with Crowley is he was very well known, and I shouldn't say is very well known within the inner circle of the elite power structure, or what I refer to as the pyramid of power. Mm-hmm. In fact, his religion of Thelema, do as thou wilt, is the spiritual belief system and the philosophy, the religion of a majority of those that reside within the pyramid of power. Yeah. And Crowley was very, very well connected into the elite power structure. And he was working for British intelligence going back to World War I, and he was an accomplished occultist. And it was in his religion of Thelema, he talks about the eon of Isis, the eon of Osiris. The eon of Osiris would equate to the Piscean age, and the eon of Horus. And Crowley taught that the eon of Osiris, which was, we can, like I said, loosely equate with the Piscean age, was an age where humans were oppressed and unenlightened, and they were shackled. So unless something changed, that's how humanity was going to exist. They were going to exist in an oppressed, shackled way.
Yeah. And
his eon of Horus was an eon of enlightenment, and because Horus being the the savior figure, like Krishna, Vishnu, Jesus, and so on, would bring humanity into a new age. The problem with this that I have talked about is that I have folks that will email me and say, well, that's not a bad thing, Mike. He's talking about unshackling humanity, and I was like, well, here's the thing, though. He's not talking to you.
Yeah.
His religion of Thelema. See, some people will say that Luciferianism doesn't have any holy texts. It doesn't have a doctrine, if you will. There's nothing written down. And my argument is I don't think that that's true. I believe Crowley's religion of Thelema is the doctrine of current-day Luciferianism. As Crowley is known as the modern-day father of modern Satanism and Luciferianism. In Crowley's book 77, he has a whole litany of things that says that man, per his will, can do all of these things unencumbered, without anybody interfering. And then at the very end he says, and if anybody, and I'm paraphrasing here, folks, if anybody should interfere, you can kill them. You can take them out if they get in your way. If they get in the way of you achieving your will, you can get rid of them. And then right below that he says, all the rest, all the others, will be our slaves. That's from his book 77. So, when I was researching him and I read book 77, I thought to myself, well, you know what? He's not talking to me. He's not talking to you. He's not talking to the audience. He's talking to the initiates and the adepts and the followers who are in the congregation of Thelema / Luciferianism. That's who he's speaking to.
Yeah.
And more specifically, he's talking to those who are in the elite power system, the power structure. So for those who are Thelemites out there that are just, the average Joe, Joe Smith out there, he's not even talking to you. It's to me, it's a system where they're looking to clearly break away from the rest of humanity, eliminate as many as they possibly can in the process. And for those who are able to cross the bridge and wind up on the other side with them, you're going to be in a role where you're a slave. You're going to be subservient to them and their system. And so a big piece of Crowley, goes back to the Eastern religions. And he himself, it all goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. And what I have said, what I have presented to my audience, John, is that the controllers are Egyptian mystery fundamentalists.
Yeah.
They're Egyptian mystery zealots. And that's their religion. And so they're imposing their religious philosophy and their principles on us. So if we go back to Crowley, they're imposing their will on us. Do as thou wilt. And in my opinion, that's what's going on right now. And because it's based in occultism, we're going through a process of ritual. We're going through a process of alchemy. So the breaking down of culture, the breaking down of society is an alchemical process. This is how they think and this is how they operate. Nothing they do, this is what folks have to understand, nothing they do is natural or organic. It's all contrived and constructed. And in their twisted minds, they believe that they can push the natural order out of the way to accomplish their goals. And this is why when we take a look at what's going on today in our world, it's all upside down. It's like a comic book. It's like we live in a cartoon. And it's because they're going about this in an inorganic, alchemical way in which they're trying to bypass the natural order.
That's absolute fact.
Yep.
And
since I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I know this is going to shatter everybody's image of the Beatles, but I saw this sort of comparison while we were talking. It's kind of like a grooming. It's like the Pied Piper groomers that the Beatles first showed up after this big trauma as this age of, oh, it's going to be okay. And so we begin to trust these fine folks from Liverpool with their nice suits and their cute little hair. And then before you know it, they've groomed you into,
Right.
oh, well, you know what? You could be doing this. Like, I mean, it's so sick when you think about it and compare it to pedophiles or some fruitcake in a van trying to get your kid in a compromising position. But that's kind of what they did. They groomed you into accepting this. And before you know it, well, you've done this. You've had all this, drugs, psychedelics, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that whole trope. And then before you know it, a couple generations, that's just infused into the American mindset and culture. And you don't even realize we were groomed into accepting this alchemical Faustian pact for like the whole generation, it seems.
Right. And I should also mention that in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, Billy alludes very, very strongly. There's nothing concrete and definitive, but it alludes to it very strongly, that his father is Aleister Crowley, his biological father. So Billy Shears is the guy that replaced Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney. And so now Crowley his thing was sex magic. And I suspect, along with my colleagues, my fellow researchers, that Billy is a result of sex magic. And children who are conceived from the act or ritual of sex magic are identified immediately for very important roles, influential roles in life later on as they progress in their life. So we believe that it's possible, very possible, that Billy was conceived via a sex magic ritual that Aleister Crowley engaged in, and Billy was the child that was born from that ritual. And I know it sounds crazy, folks. I'm telling you, I get into this research, and there are times when I have to take a step back and I think to myself, this is really unbelievable. But once you really understand what really goes on behind the curtain, in fact, I would suggest people read Daniel Esterlin's book on Tavistock.
Yeah.
That'll make your eyes cross about what Tavistock is actually involved in. People just think mind control is about hypnosis. That is not what it's just all about. And the reach of Tavistock, how it has subverted just about everything in our society, especially when we're talking about politics, we're talking about the military, we're talking about the corporatocracy. They've got their hands into everything. And, it's a very powerful organization. So I recommend folks read that book. It's going to be, for a lot of people, a shocker when they read it. But like I said, it's better to know the truth than to walk around naive and ignorant.
Man, that is so true. Well, I hate to say it, but we're almost out of time, and we got to talk more about this, because I'll try to run this by with you off the air, but there's so many connections today that just sort of sprang to mind. I've always wanted to talk to somebody about the punk industry. You mentioned the Aleister Crowley book 77, going right into 1977 with the rise of the Sex Pistols. And I spoke with John Waters, who was a journalist in Ireland and covered a lot of the early music scene there in the late 70s, 80s. And we sort of got off on a jag on exactly what we're talking about today, but I've never had that full conversation on the punk industry. I want to talk about that maybe off the air a little bit, but I have a feeling that this connects.
Yeah, it connects. I'm not an expert on the punk genre, but I will say this. We talk about the number 77. Think in terms, folks, of Flight 77 during 9/11 and the London 7/7 bombings.
Man.
Okay? So part of their occultism, a very big piece of it, is numbers. And I tell my audience they paint by the numbers. Everything is encoded. Signs and symbols rule the world. And that's another thing that a lot of people have a hard time getting their arms wrapped around. They just think numbers are just numbers. It's just something you do when you're at the cash register at the supermarket, No, it's a language within itself. It's a hidden language. It's an occulted language. And that's how they communicate out to each other. That's one of the ways, I should say, that they communicate out to each other. So, but Aleister Crowley, John, I know we have to wrap up here, is very important to everything that's going on right now, as difficult and as hard as it might be for some people to believe that. You have to really understand who the guy was and what his principles and his tenets and his religion of Thelema are all about, and understand his eons, and then you'll see how it all ties together and how it's all interconnected.
And it is dark, folks. The darker it gets, the further down you go. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Where can people find and support you? I know we got your website up on the screen there, but how else can they support and follow you?
Okay, well, if I didn't scare you,
I think we're into it.
You can go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY, sageofquay.com. And it's one-stop shop. All of my links are there. The links to, all of my Beatle research, my main YouTube channel where I did a lot of work that had nothing to do with the Beatles, and also my music because, as I mentioned to John before I started, I'm also a musician. So everything is there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If you'll stick around for about 30 seconds, I'll talk to you off the air here in a minute.
Very good. Thanks, John. Right.
Thank you, sir. Folks, we barely got our feet wet in this, but if you missed any of it, AnomicAge.com is where you're going to be able to find today's episode in its entirety. The MP3, if you just want to listen to it in the car, going to the gym, taking a walk, what have you, and definitely the video version if you'd like to curl up on the couch, nice cup of tea, and really get into some of this stuff because it's mind-blowing for sure. As I always say, you can't do everything, but you can do something. So please try to get out there and do your part. Until next time, I'll be seeing you sooner than later in the Anomic Age.
Belief is the enemy of knowing.
All right, man. Welcome to Crrow777 Radio. This is hour 1 of episode 496. Jason Lindgren is with me, and Mike Williams, or better known sometimes as Sage of Quay, has joined us. We're going to talk about music again. We feel like we've pretty much beat the Beatles. That's a bit of a dead horse. We may mention a couple things to put a bow tie on that, but we're going to broaden out into music in general. And I'm going to introduce the guys, and I'm going to bring up the charade that just happened with the band Kiss. Anyhow, welcome, Jason.
And a rather hot good morning.
And welcome back, Mike.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me back.
So I don't want to come off like a gossip. That's not why I'm bringing up what I'm bringing up here. The tone and tenor of this is to kind of indicate to people what's been done and how culture has been shaped, and how music was basically used as a tool, an agenda, if you will. But the band Kiss, who has apparently said for the 5th time this is their last tour, I actually believe them now. They're getting kind of old. They insulted one of the original members of the band on Howard Stern. And he threatened that if he didn't get an apology, he was going to drop all this dirt. And I had called Jason and I laughed. I said, wouldn't it be funny if Ace Frehley from Kiss openly admitted all the things that we've been telling you are true about the music we grew up with and love? And it turns out that I am reasonably sure he got a phone call that basically said, sit down and shut up or else, which is interesting because you could tell by the way he said things, he was a little worried about the repercussions because his magical papers were in a safe deposit box, like a dead key, right? If anything happens to me, he said he'll release it to the AP, to everybody. And I'm just bringing it up because it appears to me, this whole thing that has just happened, that this organization is still protecting its secrets and has no intention of letting something like that happen. I mean, do either you want to comment on this kind of gossipy observation?
Well, it doesn't surprise me at all, Crow. These antics as far as backing tracks and lip syncing and offstage, backstage musicians and singers has been going on since the very beginning. So, more and more information is coming out now. In fact, it was one of the guys from Twisted Sister. This goes back maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he actually came out. I think he's doing managing and producing these days. And he talked about the lip syncing that Kiss does on stage. And what folks have to come to grips with is that's how it's done, because the music industry is entertainment and there's big money involved. They're not going to take a risk that a show is going to fall flat on its face, or the vocalists or the singers for that night are not up to speed, or the playing is not where it needs to be. So, they have all of these protective measures in place, for lack of a better term, to make sure that the show goes off without a hitch. So, this is something Jason knows, that I know, that's been going on for a very long time. But to the average Joe Q public, they have no idea. They think when they go to a show that what they're hearing is actually the band playing. Now, there are bands that don't use backing tracks and offstage musicians, but plenty of them do. So the point is, this is no surprise to me that this is coming out. A lot of this stuff is coming out now, in fact.
What's interesting is when we did the last show with you, we actually got a couple contacts about people who had met doubles from big bands. And we opted not to pursue it for a couple reasons, partially because we kind of proved that Paul was a swap, and anyone in their mind can put together, if a personage that well known can be swapped, then come on, this is going on. It was a drummer, and I guess I won't say more than that, Jason. Probably good practice not to, but of all the bands, Kiss would be easy to double because they wear makeup. Right. Much easier than most places. But what's interesting about Dee Snider, he's kind of from a kitsch band, Twisted Sister, but they were sizable back in the day. They had a following, and they kind of still do. I know they've made their Christmas albums, which is kind of like the writing on the wall, but he showed up at Congress, right? Remember back in the day, he showed up to face down Congress on censorship. So it's interesting that he's still speaking out. He's had a lot of radio shows, but I'm of a mind, and I may look into this, and we maybe will put together something when we're well past 500 episodes. I am of a mind Kiss never would have been if they hadn't had every support possible. It was one of the first bands. I was telling Jason, actually, I think I misspoke, Jason. My first album that I had in my possession was a Beach Boys album. The second album was Deep Purple, made in Japan. The third album was a Kiss album. And knowing the history of that band, I think this is a classic case of these guys were intended to go the distance, and they got the backing they needed to get. In other words, had they been just regular guys on the street, they would have fallen by the wayside, the amount of time it took them to find traction. And I don't know if either of you feel that way, but I think I could probably demonstrate it if I did due diligence.
Well, Kiss's songwriting isn't really that great. Let's just be honest about that.
Now, Kiss definitely had the machine behind them. That was the beginning of the overt Satanism that was being presented on stage. So, to your point about doubles, Crow, I had a person contact me going back a number of years ago. Maybe it was around 3 or 4 years ago. This person told me that they were addressed, or a discussion was had with them on 2 separate occasions in 2 different cities. And he looks a lot like, quote, Paul McCartney or Billy Shears. And I know this because he sent me a picture. And from a starting point to create a double, he was a very good starting point. And he told me he was in one city. I guess he was on vacation with his wife. And somebody came up to him and said, hey, you'd make a good double for Paul McCartney. And then the guy said to him, say something. So he has a Southern accent. So he said, well, they'd have to do something with the accent, right? It was very peculiar. So that was one situation. And then he told me that he was in another city traveling, and somebody else came up to him with the same exact comments. So we can look at it as coincidence, or we can look at it and say that there's a possibility that they're scouting for doubles. And like I said, he sent me a picture of himself, and I looked at it and said, yep. I mean, he would be a good person as far as his physical appearance, the way his face structure is and all that stuff. He's a great candidate to start creating a double. I'd never shown the picture because out of respect and privacy for the gentleman, but this is how, this is, I think, how it works. They're out there scouting, and they're looking for individuals and people that'll play into the into the theatrics.
There's another aspect to this we should point out. So often these little tricks are put right out into the public consciousness, and it's done in clever ways where we pretty much just act like it's, par for the course. Nobody thinks twice. Think of you're old enough, Mike. Think of Mission Impossible. One of the big premises in that movie or in that television show that started in black and white, if I'm not mistaken, is they're having problem with a country leader. So they go in and they drug them and they take them out and they replace them. And it's often a member of the team. And it was interesting the way they did it, because at the end, they're using the same actor, but they're implying that the agent now has a prosthetic on his face and a voice device so that it's all spot on. They were showing this back in the 60s. And now I realize why. I mean, what do you think? Do you remember that show where they were showing this all the time?
Yeah. It goes way back. We can go back and take a look at Stalin, and it's well documented now how many doubles he had. There's a very interesting conspiracy out there with regard to Jimmy Carter, that Carter was swapped out. I think by the time he got 2 years into his term, his hair was being parted on, the opposite side and all of that stuff. So it's very difficult for people to get their heads wrapped around, because, folks don't live their life like that. So they go about doing whatever they do, go to work, keep a roof over their head, take care of their children and all that stuff. But the machinery behind the curtain, the stuff that they do, the average person has no concept.
No, it's the reason for conversations like this, because this is how we get fooled. Everyone loves music, right? Anyone who doesn't like music. And what's interesting about music is when you dissect how it's been delivered in this country, you can see how it's targeted. Like if you go to certain places down south, there will be different radio stations. This will be a country western place or a country music place. You go to another place and you can see how it's been segmented, almost like red and blue, almost like the political thing. And you can also see easily, we've covered it, how a decade comes to an end and the whole flavor and sense. And that's a weird thing, because since we passed the year 2000, I don't know about you, Mike, I don't know about you, Jason, but back in the 1900s, every time a decade was coming to an end, I could feel it. And when we got into the new decade, you could sense that things were different now. The 80s had ended, the things are different. But since we have crossed the threshold of 2000, I haven't even noticed, nor could I point out why the first 10 years of 2000 is somehow peculiar culturally to the next. And someone might say it's because you're old, Crow, but I mean, do you guys have the same idea where it doesn't feel like decades are the same as they used to be?
The 90s seems to be the last of the original decades as far as modern culture, especially pop culture. It seems like there's nothing all that identifiable. I mean, maybe if you got really picky about like certain ways with jeans and things like that, but nothing like the 60s really looks like the 60s, which does not look like the 80s, that kind of thing.
Yeah, do you notice it? Do you feel a decade division in the 2000s, Mike?
No, I absolutely do. You go back to since 2000, I'm saying prior to 2000, let me just say it that way, I see a clear delineation between the decades.
So to me, this is social engineering. This is homogenization. What you will notice, and I always use the example of cars, back in the 60s, every color car you could imagine, when a Challenger came out and it was successful, the other companies would have their muscle car that went against it. They'd be quite different. As a matter of fact, sometimes even unique colors would come with the car. That has gone away. Now, when you see a BMW of a certain SUV class and compare it to a Hyundai or other, they look very similar, and the colors have been just muted down to not that many options. This is social engineering, and I think that's what we are seeing. As a matter of fact, here's one for you. I'm going to ask you both, because you're both musicians. You're both better musicians than I am. Can you remember the last decade when key changes in popular music that you might hear on the radio or that's being sold typically as current music, when key changes were a part of the popular music last decade? What do you think, Mike?
Well, the last decade has been just a miserable experience as far as I'm concerned with music. and it's all, in my opinion, very mechanical. So you're not going to have a lot of key changes and a lot of creativity like that in the music. They're not interested in creativity anymore.
Right.
What they're interested in is creating music that has a hypnotic essence to it, and is displaying and putting forth and normalizing their agenda. So as an example, what I mean by that is if we take a look at these dance routines and these displays like at halftime and all that stuff with football, it's all ritualistic. So in my mind, that's where they're at right now. They're no longer interested in really good, solid songwriting anymore, because the good songwriting was something they had to do going back, starting in, the 50s, going into the 1960s, especially, in order to create the foundation that they were going to build upon. Right. So that's what they always do. They always create a foundation. And that foundation is built based upon a broad acceptance of what Tavistock and the Frankfurt School and CIA expect or anticipate is going to be accepted from a broad perspective. And then from there, they move forward and they begin to make changes, and you're not hearing what you used to hear anymore. The music is getting worse and worse and worse, and it's not intended anymore to be really a listening experience. It's really intended to be a social engineering initiative or a social engineering project that is based in sound, frequency, and vibration.
Which rap underscores. I
Exactly.
mean, a lot of rap doesn't even fit the definition of music, because melody and harmony and other things, if you look up the definition, maybe you would call it poetry to a beat, if I want to be generous.
Here comes the emails, Crow, again.
Yeah, the emails will come. I mean, I'm sorry. I badmouth my own music. I know what it was. It was social engineering. The difference is that way back when I was young and very into music, it was at least a little bit musical, and actually less so than the prior decades. You had big bands. Every person on that stage read music, had new music theory. But I was going to mention, Jason, if you had to guess, last decade where popular music commonly had key changes, what would you say?
The 80s.
Well, you're not far. The 90s, but it was diminished from the 80s. And so this underscores the point that Mike just made. The diversity, the complexity that music can have has been on a steady down trajectory as we came into the 80s and rock and roll was starting to burn itself out in what they like to call hair bands. It became, conveyor belt music, and it's worse now, right? It is. It's very hypnotic. But can you imagine almost 30 years now of popular music without much key change? It's crazy to think about. And that kind of proves what music is used for in social agenda terms.
So we're at the point where the music now is disposable. There's nothing coming out, for the most part, that's on pop radio. And when you think about what pop is today compared to what pop was in the 60s, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, that was pop music back then. The Who, like all those big bands, that was pop music then. Today, this computerized garbage with these ridiculous characters that they invent to center it on. I mean, this stuff won't be remembered 20 years from now. It's computerized, quantized to death. It's too perfect. And it just sounds ludicrous, really. As a matter of fact, it sounds so bad that if you take old stuff, and I've listened to people do this on YouTube videos, if you take, say, like Boston, where that singer, I think his name was Brad Delp, and you throw it in Auto-Tune or Melodyne, one of those pitch correction softwares, and do it the way they do it now, it doesn't sound right. It's too good. The naturalness is removed, and it just loses its humanity.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jason. It loses its humanity. There's no longer a human element to it anymore. That's the thing, you go back to the older days, going back to the 60s and 70s, even, in my mind, even to the 80s, there was still a lot of human input into the music that you were hearing. And today it's this very digitized, sterile sound. And you're absolutely right with regard to Auto-Tune and Melodyne. I have a friend of mine who's he's a sound engineer, and he's been in the business for a long time. And he was telling me, now I don't use Melodyne. And I do everything organically. When you listen to one of my songs, it's me, But he was saying that the technology has gotten to the point where if you play an E chord, an open E chord out of tune, that the software packages like Melodyne will correct it and put it into perfect tune. So you have to think to yourself, well, okay, what's that all about? And what it's all about is it's all tied into the technocracy. It's all about everything is going to be technology based, even your listening experience. Even something as simple as listening to music is just going to be bastardized by the technology.
Soul removed.
Yes.
Spirit removed.
Yeah.
Can you imagine listening to some of the old classic Zeppelin, which tends to hold up over the decades, put through Melodyne? I imagine it wouldn't even be listenable, right?
Well, the little variations that someone like a singer like Robert Plant, the last thing you'd want to do is take that out. Even the Beatles doing a lot of those live harmonies they do, when they would double and triple their vocals, they'd stand around one mic together. And of course, it's not 100% perfect, but it sounds thick because it's natural people doing real vocal tracks. Same thing with Queen. They would do, I think it was 3 sets of 3 or 4, where the 3 out of the 4 members were singers. That's how they got that giant operatic sound. And then they'd mix all that together. So you had 12 or 16 voices or something like that going on. You don't do that anymore. People just layer it and then throw it in the software and boom. Sometimes they don't even do that. Sometimes they're so lazy, they just duplicate tracks. And I've played around and done it, and I don't like the way it sounds, but you can just duplicate the main track and then just create harmonies off of that. So of course you have the same exact line sung in the exact same way that's been pitch corrected and had the life edited out of it, and then you're duplicating that and just putting it in a different key, and it just sounds like a robot singing to a robot.
Right.
I don't know if you guys are of a mind like I am, but I don't remember how long ago. It was a long time ago when I realized that I knew Paul had been swapped, and that I began to realize that the Beatles is not what I once thought they were. With the work of people like you, Mike, and others, when you realize the scope of what a put up that was, it was basically, if you want to be honest, it was basically put together to be a social engineering apparatus. It was to deliver and program agenda. And when you know that's occurred and you come across the level at which things were done, then you can only move forward assuming that it's been done in other places. How can you not? Right? Once you perfect a trick like that, are you going to accept that it happened once? I'm not. And so I started to look around years ago at the field of music, and I began to identify bands that in my mind, I think were complete constructs. And I want to get your guys' point of view. I have not done the due diligence to back up what I'm going to say further than I have a very good intuition. And there are points along the way with things that I've seen that really back up what my intuition is telling me is true. Bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd, to me, that band's a put up. Kiss never would have made it had they not had the full weight of intention and support put behind them. There are a number that I think we could say. And then you start thinking of bands like The Who. And I think it is clear as a bell that those big British bands were all agenda bands. So when we come down the line, what do you guys think? Are any of those big bands that we all grew up loving, are they free of anything that we covered when we started with the Beatles? Basically this is a band as a social agenda tool. It's why it's here. It's why we made it.
Go ahead, Jason. You go first.
So the thing I've noticed being into music for many, many years is you don't get anywhere without knowing anyone. And when you're super young, late teens and early 20s, I've had this discussion with a good friend of mine who I've been in and out of bands with, played with for many years. You don't know jack shit, and you're so green, and that if you don't have someone taking you by the hand to help guide you, because this is the conversation we've had multiple times, we were trying to do all this stuff, and we had raw talent, and we had the gusto to want to do it, but we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And nobody who was older and experienced was bothering to say, hey, maybe you should just try it like this or try it like that. Even so far as paying for studio time, we didn't know any better, and we were just letting them throw an SM57 up on a guitar cabinet, and that's it. And then nothing about layering and all the stuff that makes things sound like a professional production. No one gave a shit, to be blunt. So for these bands to have gotten as far as they did in the early days, they had to have had people guiding them, because there's no way that they knew what they were doing, especially when you're going all the way back to the 60s when this stuff was new and people really didn't know what they were talking about.
Well, when Mike, you're about to answer, let me layer this on top as you respond here. In your mind, is like, you've heard the story, the young girl, the young boy going to go to Hollywood and meet their fame and fortune. That's the example. Is it even possible? Is it even possible to go find fame and fortune if you're at that level, to make the top of the pops, if you're not knighted in somehow? Anyhow, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's a good setup, Crow, because the way I have deducted that it works is we've got 3 tiers, if you will. So the first tier would be those musicians that make up bands or as an individual artist that are bloodline connected into the controlling system, into the pyramid of power. These would be bands and singers and artists. They're going to see very, very significant and prominent success and fame because they're bloodline. They're in the system. So they're going to be moved along. A lot of money is going to be put behind them to make sure that they get to where the social scientists want them to be. Then you have those that are not bloodline connected, but they are in secret societies, Freemasonry as an example. We'll just use that as the umbrella of secret society. And they are also moved along because they're going to promote the agenda. So we have the first tier, which is their bloodline, like Billy's bloodline. David Crosby was bloodline. And just by the sheer fact that they have that type of connection, it's assured that they're going to push the agenda forward. They're going to do what needs to get done. And then the second tier would be those that are in secret societies, regardless of what degree they're at. But, the higher degrees they are in the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, the more they're going to be, the controllers are going to be assured that they're going to cooperate and push the agenda. So, these bands are also going to have money put behind them. And then you have this third tier. And this third tier are artists, bands that are not in secret societies and they are not in the pyramid of power. However, they have resources or they have skills and talents that have been identified by the controllers that can be leveraged.
Can you give an example of what that level a band might be that you view at that level?
Let me see. Let's take a look at somebody like Britney Spears as an example.
Okay.
Just use her as an example. Okay.
Okay.
Katy Perry is another.
Performers.
Yes, performers. And they're brought in because they can be shaped. They're groomed, they're handled. Now, were they groomed and handled prior to winding up on the radar, Tavistock's radar, or whatever social scientists' radar? I don't know. We can debate that till the cows come home.
Well, some of these people were Musketeers, so what was going on there?
Exactly.
There's
So
the talent pool, right?
Right. So that's right. So think of it exactly right, Crow. There's a talent pool. There's a pool of resources that are out there. And the controllers are always scouring it. And if they can make something of somebody, if they're going to fit the mold or the role of the next genre of music that they're going to put out and they're going to bombard the public with, they bring them in. But these types, they typically don't have a very long shelf life. They're used for a moment in time and then they're just discarded.
But what about the young African-American girl who was in a vampire movie, got really big, and then cashed it on a plane takeoff? Aja, what do you know who I'm talking about? Anybody?
Aaliyah.
Aja?
Aaliyah.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, so we have these layers. This is what I've identified. It's one of those things where the controllers they're very creative and their system is very sophisticated. And so, they're pulling from different pools of resources to be able to implement their agenda via the music industry and the entertainment industry, because what I'm talking about now is not just music, but it's also in the entertainment industry. If we take a look at Hollywood as an example. So yeah, so the bands that are really, really big, they're in it. I mean, they're in it because they're actually tied into it from either a bloodline or from a brotherhood, secret society perspective. And then the third tier are just those that they're bringing in and they're using them. They're just using and abusing them. They just happen to be good tools at the moment. And as soon as that tool is no longer useful, then they get discarded. Even bands that maybe are not aware of the agenda and then they get signed to a major label, we have to remember that it's not just about the music, but it's also the symbolism that comes along with it. So the album jacket will have all types of Illuminati symbolism. So the band may not even be aware of what that symbolism means. They just came in and they recorded their tracks, but the way the record is packaged. And there are so many stories about songwriters and bands that have come in who got signed to a label. Their songs got altered. Their songs got changed. So in order to fit what a producer deemed needed to get done in order to make that song, quote, marketable, which also includes, by the way, if an original band member was laid down the recorded track, let's say the guitar track, later on, a producer will bring in a ringer, a hired gun, and redo the guitar tracks or the bass track or the drumming. So there's all this stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And the point I'm trying to make without getting too long-winded here is I believe, there are bands and there are artists that are not immersed in the agenda. They may not even be really aware of it, but they're still manipulated based upon how the songs are put together, how it's packaged, and how it's presented when they go out and they play live, as an example. Like the whole stage presentation will have pyramids on it and eyes on it, all-seeing eyes. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up some huge points based on the comments the two of you have just made. First of all, the idea of the throwaway people. Look at Britney Spears, good example. Look what happened to the poor girl. She lost her damn mind. Whether that was drugs or more, I think it was more. And the reason I think it was more is because of how the entertainment community felt sorry for her and swept in to try to be around her. But here's the thing about music like that, which is throwaway music. And by the way, you're not going to find key changes for the most part. It's been dumbed down, which also dumbed down music has a dumbing down effect, just to be brutally honest about it. There's a thing called nostalgia programming that I first brought up with Jason. I think it was episode 76, moments before my YouTube channel was deleted because we told the truth about Mandalay Bay and the dark magic that was going on there based on Macbeth and the Three Witches. Nostalgia programming dictates some of the following things, at least what I am aware of. There's probably a lot that I'll never be aware of. When you're 13 or 12 and you love Britney Spears, when you become 40 and you haven't heard that music in a long time and you do, that will sweep you right back to that childhood, to those pleasant memories. Matters not the quality of the music. It's just that the music serves as that magical smell you remember when you were young, that magical song, that magical time, your first kiss, and Britney happened to be on the radio. That nostalgia programming is among some of the strongest programming. So I want to make the point that even in so-called throwaway music, its day is not done when they're not recording anymore. In 20 or 30 years, the nostalgia programming abilities of that are going to be brought back on that generation. And to Mike's point about the packaging, I will just simply briefly bring up a thing called sigils. The packaging matters. Geometry has energy, but if anyone wants to take a look at sigils, you can look it up on your own time. It's a little bit like Dr. Emoto embedding intent into water. That's basically one aspect of what a sigil is. What is a sigil? It's a shape. One of the ways you make a sigil, just to make the point, is you come up with a sentence of what you want to accomplish, then you remove all the vowels, any of the doubled consonants, and you make basically a logo. That's one of the simplest ways to do it. And you embed your intent and the meaning from the sentence that initially served as the foundation. You can find this on almost any album ever made. in one shape or form of a logo or something else. But guys, I want to bring up the dead ringer here. I want to bring up Supertramp. When I was in the 80s, I used to tell people Supertramp is such an underrated band, such a great band. They're using interesting instruments. They're not a carbon copy. You know, you're not just hearing the same 12-bar blues you've heard to death. But what we know about Supertramp now underwrites what we're pointing out. On Breakfast in America, and Words Have Meaning, they titled a track and an album, Breakfast in America. If you look at the artwork and you turn it backwards or look at it in a mirror, it says 9/11 right in the heading. And there's New York City has been put together. In other words, they're pre-shadowing something like 22 years. I think it's the Master Mason building number. I forget, but I think it's 22 years before the fact. They're preluding the 9/11 attacks. Now, if you take that band apart, you will find that first, one of the stories goes that some mysterious figure paid them $1 million to get together. They went out on tour. It was unsuccessful. So they pulled them back and they put them through boot camp. And that's how they finally got them on the road making money. If you go look at where their albums were recorded, it's in old Masonic temples that had since been turned into recording studios. My point is that Supertramp is case and point for what we're talking about. And how can anyone listen to that band now knowing that their album cover preluded the event that tumbled us for good? The reason we are where we are now is because that event occurred. That is the beginning of the open fall of America. And for anyone who's not quite caught up, we are no longer an empire. We will not be the empire we once were. We will not be bullying people. We've been demoted, just to make it clear. And that's what I'm talking about. 22 years before the fact, they encoded the event, which had to already be clearly planned. They recorded their album in Masonic temples that had been converted over. And I just want to open up that conversation. I don't know what you two might know about the band, which really does underscore the proof that's in the pudding here.
It's funny you should bring them up because before you said Supertramp, I was thinking about that album cover.
It's a hell of a thing.
Yeah, it's predictive programming is what it is. And the point that you made, Crow, about the planning, this is something that a lot of folks really don't understand. The planning is not done like day by day or week by week. They have things planned out decades in advance, at least.
Yes.
That's why it's very difficult for folks to get their heads wrapped around this, because most people can't plan beyond a day or two or maybe even a week because of everything that goes on in their life. And then what people do is they take their own lives and extrapolate that and say, well, everything works that way. And they don't understand that there is a controlling mechanism. There's a controlling infrastructure that controls the world. You know, I try to explain to my audience, we've got organizations like the World Economic Forum, we have Tavistock, we have the Committee of 300, we have the Fabian Society, we have the Rockefeller Foundation, we have the Bilderbergs, we have the Trilaterals, we have the Council on Foreign Relations, we have Davos. What do you think these organizations do? You think that they just create the buildings and play solitaire all day long? This internationalist structure is there for a reason, and it's because it's running the world. The whole facade that you think that your president is actually running something. I mean, it's even a bigger joke now with Joe Biden, right? I mean, but be that as it may, or that your prime minister, if you're out in Europe someplace, is actually calling the shots. I mean, you are very, very misguided, and you're really not awake, and you don't understand how the world really works. You know, so taking it back to the Supertramp album again, 20 something years ago, predictive programming, and we have lots of examples like that. I mean, we have examples like that in The Simpsons, for God's sake.
We do. Isn't it astonishing that The Simpsons gets history better than the evening news? But
right.
with regard to Supertramp, I want to make the point of how some of this magic works. You bought the music, you loved the music, you poured your energy, your spirit into the people planning this event. And just to make a point, it's insulting. And it's insulting only for people who've woken up from the dream. Everyone else is considered profane, a sheep, whatever they might want to label them. If you look at the album cover, they've taken the Statue of Liberty and turned her into a waitress. Her name is Libby. Liberty is a word that is used heavily in the military. It has nothing to do with freedom. When I was in the Marine Corps, if I got liberty, I was informed how many hours of liberty I had, and then it was over.
Right.
The back of that album is about a meal. It's break fast. So 22 years, I think it was 22 years before the fact, they were announcing that they were going to break the fast and go open operational. Now, you will notice she's holding an orange juice. Orange is the only color that reduces numerically to 33. It also represents the sun, or maybe even, wait for it, the May sun. There is so much that has been put into this album work that you learn to love long before you comprehended, most still don't, that it was pre-echoing one of the most horrendous things that's ever happened to this country that put us on the trajectory of where we are now. A country that is facing cryptocurrency that is programmable, that will slave out everything you do. You can buy this, you can't buy this. You can go here, you can't go. That's where we're going. This is all based on the broken fast or the breaking of the fast to go operational. We're in the open. Everything we do now is on the evening news because these people are so freaking spellbound, they can't even distinguish their own index finger from their toe. These are the ideas behind it. But I want to make that point because, Mike, you and I remember album covers. Jason, to some degree, you do too. It was a whole experience. That album meant so much and it had such an importance. But that artwork, when used to evil ends, we have given it our energy, haven't we?
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's another thing I explain to my audience. There's two types of energy. There's your spiritual or non-physical energy, your consciousness, and then there's your physical energy. So they steal your non-physical or consciousness by having you focus on these bands or these entertainers and these celebrities. So as you're focused on them in the land of occultism and magic and ritual, they're harnessing that energy. And it doesn't matter whether the audience believes that that actually takes place. This is what the priesthood, the magicians and the occultists believe. This is what they practice. So they're capturing your consciousness. They're capturing your thinking. They're capturing your focus and your concentration. And by doing that, they're able to steer you. Like Crow was just saying, you're looking at the album covers or even singing the songs, because a lot of these songs have backmasking in them and,
Right.
Right. So when you're singing them and you're humming them in the song from the perspective of an occultist, you are engaged and continuing the ritual. Now, the physical energy that they're usurping from you would be you buying the records, buying their merch, going to the concerts.
Physical labor.
Physical labor, because you have to actually work. You have to physically go out and work to make a buck. And then you're taking the money that is left after they steal it through taxes, and you're giving it back to them in the form of buying records, CDs, DVDs, merchandise, and so on. And I have explained so many times, Crow and Jason, to my audience that we have to stop the idol worship, because that's really what it is at the end of the day. Think of these rock stars and these entertainers and these celebrities. They're an intermediary, right? They're like the lesser gods. And if you watch the series American Gods, it talks about the new gods are the technology gods. And that's what they do. That's how they usurp your non-physical and your physical energy. It's by pulling you into this pop culture, into social media, into the music and into the entertainment industry.
And they pulled that. That show got too close, I think. They pulled that right in the middle of its popularity.
Yeah, after 3 seasons, it got pulled. And but it was, in my opinion, it was a very important series.
Yes.
Because it talked about the old gods and the new gods, and the new gods are the technology gods.
Right.
And this is what's playing out.
No, it was a very important little piece for someone who I see with, and it was so blatant that they were doing similar things to test how awake you are. They kept doing these drone shots or aerial shots where someone would be on blacktop that's all cracked. But if you were paying attention, you would realize that the cracks spell somewhere in America. Yeah. They were being very specific. But one of the biggest things that came out of that relates exactly to what Mike and I are talking about stealing your energy. And actually, it's not a theft, you're giving it, but I'll just call it stealing because you don't comprehend that you're in a transaction. So you are being duped. They did a god named Vulcan who did bullets and guns. He made them, manufactured them. And this is where they tipped their hat in a way that I've never seen it tipped before. One of the guys that came with the main god, who was portraying Odin, an old god, he always carried a sledgehammer, and he worked in a slaughterhouse killing pigs, hitting them in the head with a sledgehammer. Every one of those pigs was a sacrifice being collected, a blood ritual. Now, the guy who made the guns, they made the point by showing on the butt of the bullet where it might say Winchester was his claim. It had his little sigil, the little symbol, and his name. And while the new god, where the old gods were saying, where can we get our sacrifices and our worship? He was living high on the hog, because every one of those bullets has the potential to kill someone. And when it does, or it hurts someone, they collect the ritual blood sacrifice energy. And these are bridges that are so far for most people, but I'm glad you brought that up. Mike, is there anything you want to bring up? When we come back in the second hour, I'm going to bring up the idea that fame is on loan. I'm going to use Prince, and then I'm going to delve further into the idea of worship that you just opened the door for. But is there anything else you'd like to get in the last few minutes of hour one?
The only thing I can think of, Crow, is when we talk about worship, I explain again to my audience that if you're going to invest your focus on someone, it needs to be yourself, because you need to develop yourself as an individual. It's a soul's journey, and your soul came here to have the experience and to learn. It's about soul development. And by doing what they're doing, the technology gods, what they're doing is that they're keeping you from realizing and manifesting who you are as an individual and as a sovereign soul. I've said to folks, the controllers want you to focus on community. It's communal stuff. When you do that, without first developing the individual aspect of yourself, then you're going to have a weak community. So as an individual, you have to work on being creative, resilient, resourceful. And then when you have a creative, resilient, and resourceful number of individuals and they come together as a community, then your community reflects those attributes and those characteristics, and you're going to have a strong community. This is why all the time, they take the individual out of the equation. They don't want anybody talking about individual development or a focus on individuality. They pour it all into the communal bucket. And that's why we're at today, because we have very weak communities, whether it be, local communities, national communities, worldwide communities. It really doesn't matter. Most people have lost their individual sovereignty, and they're not coming from that perspective. And this is why we have the problems we have today, because people are relying on people outside of them to fix the issues. So when you don't develop your individuality, what you're doing is you've actually given up your authority. You've disempowered yourself because you handed the authority over to somebody else outside of you. And when you do that, you empowered the people or the entities that are outside of you. So all the people who are on TV telling you what it is you should do and not do, what's safe and what's effective, all of that stuff, people who are following their leads, you have abdicated, you have given up your will, your authority, and your empowerment, and you handed it over to those types.
It's a good point, because underneath it all, you've forgotten what applies to you. And what applies to you is the idea, and it's deeper than the idea of sovereignty. I am. You should think about that. You should go back to the Bible and read where that's said, and you should consider what it means. And then consider, in every spiritual tradition that I think has value, you will find, don't go looking for the creator all over, look within.
Right.
And now think about what it means to say, I am. It's exactly what Mike said. That's why communism is such a difficult thing. And unfortunately, I've lived my entire life with 9 of the pillars of communism in place in this country. People say what's coming, what they're going to try to do is some kind of a bizarre, extreme techno-communism. It remains to be seen. But I now have many people who agree with me that are way more spiritually adept than I am, that say what's about to happen is going to fail in the long run. We're going to wrap up hour one here. When we come back, I'm going to open up with the idea that fame is on loan. A friend of mine named Dave J., who was one of the early voices online, he did not pull punches. He did not ever shy away from what he felt was right. He was censored off every platform all the time, and it never stopped. And he came up with an idea about fame that I have since furthered, but it's right. I know it's right. We're also going to outline what is worship. Do you have a good idea in your mind of what worship is? I'm going to get into this because Mike bringing up American Gods. American Gods put more on the table than I've ever seen any modern show put on the table, and then they cut it. They cut that umbilical cord right as it was picking up. Jason, anything you want to get in before I have Mike tell folks where they can find them?
Well, I think the big thing we have to really consider here is how bad the cult of celebrity has become. And the cult of celebrity was so big around the Beatles, just to use them as the ultimate example, that mystique is still lasting to today.
It is. It's constantly refostered. And with the new movie and all the AI nonsense, I am convinced that there are portrayals of people like Lennon that were made by AI and inserted in there. I am convinced of it. Whether I could ever prove it, probably not. Anyhow, Mike, why don't you tell folks where they can find you and your work, and then we'll prep up for hour 2.
Okay, I just want to say, off of Jason's comment, the cult of the Beatles, I can vouch that it's very much well and alive. It's there, very strong. To reach me, contact me, go to my hub website, Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com, and all of my links to my work, my music, and all that stuff is there. So it's one-stop shop.
Right, there it is. We're going to wrap up hour 1 of episode 496. We're going to take a few minutes to take a break, and we're going to come back and we're going to nail a important hour 2. I'll put it that way. We've got the right people here to do it. With that, you can catch the first hour of any episode at Crrow777radio.com, Crrow777radio.com. We have just syndicated the hour 1s on the blockchain, believe it or not, on World Wide Web 3. Was it Chat Garden? Do you remember the name, Jason?
Oh, we're going to look that up again.
Yeah, we're going to have to look that up. I can never remember. Anyhow, I'll put it out in hour 2. With that, I would like to wish you all a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era, and I hope to see you with membership on the other side for the full 2 hours. By the way, all members get access to Shoot the Moon, the 2-hour film that Jason made about my telescope work. There it is. We'll see you shortly. Cheers. All right, now welcome back to Crrow777 Radio. This is hour 2 of episode 496. Jason Lindgren is back, as is Mike Williams, or Sage of Quay. And Rose pinged me. I can never remember. I don't know why it's so simple. The blockchain that's housing us on the World Wide Web 3 is called Cast Garden. And we've put all our first hour content out there. Part of it I did intentionally because of the blockchain, but that's a whole other conversation I'm not getting into right now. Welcome back, guys.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
All right, let's jump in where we promised we would. It was years ago, and there were a few early voices that are among the people who influenced me the most on YouTube in terms of what we've been doing all these years. One of those was Dave J., and he did not pull punches. And he run into a fire headlong if he thought he had a reason to do it. He never shied from anything, and the result of that was they just removed him from everywhere all the time. And he brought up the idea of what fame is, and I've since walked with it away. So what I accept is correct right now is fame is on loan, and here's how I frame it up. Imagine one day you're just somebody, let's just use a musician, and you want to be famous. Until you are knighted, you're not. At some point, someone says, okay, we're going to do this album and market it and make you huge, or, however it goes, whether you're an actor or anything else. And at that moment, if you honestly assess what's just happened, you're basically telling someone you're going to basically live like a king, kind of, from here forward. You're going to have money. You won't need money. You don't really need a passport. You can go wherever you want. You're going to be treated differently than a so-called civilian. But that's on loan. And I am now convinced by personage such as Prince that they knew exactly how long it was on loan. The first album he put out that made it big was Purple Rain album, right? It was, I think it's 1983 or 84, might be 84, I don't know. But in it, if the elevator tries to get you down, go crazy. Well, he's, they portrayed him as dying in an elevator. That was pre-echoed in a Rick and Morty when the scientist formerly known as Prince, or however they did it, they made a version of Rick who was Prince, and they showed him killed in the elevator before Prince was killed. But here's the thing. Prince knew it. And the whole time that he was fighting for his contractual life, he knew it had to do with his name. That name is what's on loan to you, right? When your name is made famous, I'm convinced that a lot of people probably don't even, does Britney Spears own her own name? I don't know. But, that's maybe not a good example. Take the name of a big band. Who knows who owns the rights on that? They'll show the public as if the band does. But what he did is he ditched his name and went to an unpronounceable symbol, proving that he knew the problem had to do with the name. So let's open up the conversation there.
Yeah, I think this goes along with what we said in the first part, Crow, where they own you. If you're going to achieve any level, significant level of fame and fortune, there's going to be concessions that you're going to have to make to get there. They dangle the carrot. And if you want more, they'll give you more. But in getting more, there are going to be things you're going to have to do, things you're going to have to participate in. There are going to be consequences. And there are going to be things that you're going to get involved in that you normally wouldn't touch or you wouldn't get involved in. But, if you're chasing the paper, you're chasing the fame and fortune, and you really want it and you can taste it, people do certain things. And so his name, Prince, there's got to be a contractual agreement in place, which said that as an individual, I doubt that he would be able to go off and do something under the name of Prince without having significant legal implications and complications in trying to do that. I mean, we see this with bands that broke up. And they want to go out and say, I'm trying to think of a band off the top of
Creedence Clearwater Revival is one, right?
Right. I want to go out and be Creedence. And then, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. No, you cannot.
Fogerty is another.
Right. It's a machine. It's tied together with contracts. There's tons and tons of money involved. And forget about the whole control mechanism. Just think about it from the standpoint of the greed of the money. And there's going to be a lot of artists that are going to be stifled and not even realizing that they're going to be suppressed or stifled down the road because they really didn't understand what it is they signed up for.
So at the time when the whole Prince thing was happening, I mean, there was a beer being released. I don't remember all the things. I think for some reason, Hoover, one of the big dams, was flashed purple right as it was happening or something like that. There were so many indicators, something to do with the Prince's or the Queen's birthday, if I remember correctly. But there were so many things. But one of the things that really stuck out to me, and Jason's probably going to have to help me with the name of the song from the band America. The first time this country ever heard these two words put together, as far as I know, Purple Rain, was in an America song. And it's a whole verse. And it basically talks about a guy named Joe, which was one of Prince's aliases. And it says, what are you going to do? I don't know. It's okay. You can always change your name or you can do these things. It looks like you've been hit by Purple Rain. Do you know that? Is it Ventura Highway, Jason?
Yeah, I believe so.
So I think it's Ventura Highway. But that was written in. And so I started chasing this down, and as fate would have it, the internet was in full swing then. Someone had reached out to the supposed author of that song and said, why did you write that verse? And he responded, I couldn't tell you. And it was just thing after thing where you could see, like, is it really possible that a big band like America back in the day is prepping up for a guy that we're going to hear about in the 80s?
The thing we should also note is the word rain. And I was actually rereading Daniel Esterlin's book on Tavistock, and he has a couple of pages dedicated to Rain Man and a lot of rap and hip hop artists. I think Eminem is one of them. They have the lyric Rain Man. What does that mean? Well, rain and Rain Man implies a deal with the devil, deal with Satan. It's a pact. So when they sing about Rain Man or they sing about rain, the first thing we should think about knowing this is, are they communicating out that there was a pact, there was a going to the crossroads moment that put this artist front and center? Like even the Beatles song, Rain, The Who, Rain on Me.
Spelled as a reigning monarch, spelled not like rain on your head, but as R-E-G, it's
right.
Like a monarch reigns.
Exactly. So, but they do wordplay all the time. You guys know this. Think about how many times in videos, album covers, you see an umbrella, rain. So this is something that I want to point out too. I found a link to it. You won't find much on Rain Man. It seems to have been scrubbed
because of Estlin.
Yeah, probably because of Daniel's book. But I did find one link which was very informative. And this is something that I presented out to my audience about, I guess about 2 or 3 weeks ago, as it pertained to the Beatles and the song Rain. But there are a lot of songs that refer to rain and or Rain Man. And from an occult perspective, it's pointing back to a pact. It's a deal that you made to get where you are.
And pulls in the symbolism of the umbrella.
Yes.
Anyone who wants to read Daniel Estlin's book, I know exactly what he's talking about. I've read it a few times. I even referenced it and took research further. Some of my world population research was based on where Estlin started and some of the clever methods he laid down. That's how I leveraged off to do mine. By the way, Rose just pinged me. When Prince was dying, the Queen released a Purple Rain beer, which is spelled R-E-I-G-N, to reign as a queen would. But this is the thing. I think most people have it in their minds that they could become famous. And I don't know what you guys think. I think maybe occasionally that happens, but I think it's like less than a fraction of 1%. I think someone is chosen out for whatever reason, or even groomed maybe. But think of the idea of the America song. If all that's correct, and all those 40 years or whatever it is prior, they're queuing up for a guy named Prince or someone who's going to sing a song that makes him famous called Purple Rain. As a matter of fact, think about this. So he then goes on to play the biggest show in the world, which is Super Bowl halftime. One of the biggest shows in terms of how many people are watching. That is huge. And what happens is he opens up with Purple Rain, it rains. So you suppose they did a little weather mod there for him, or was that all just chance? We can't answer these questions, but I am completely convinced that the idea that you have talent and you head off to Hollywood and find fame and fortune, I don't think it works that way. What do you think, Jason? Do you accept that it works that way?
I think there's a percentage of them that are probably just moneymakers. They're there because they need extra fodder. But the biggest of the biggest of the biggest, pretty sure that's a setup for one reason or another. And Mike broke down the tiered system, and I think that's probably pretty accurate.
It's crazy to consider because, what is the culture of America? The way I say it is we watch some movies and we like some TV shows. Oh yeah, and we listen to some music. So basically what we're talking about here is how culture is shaped.
Yeah, I don't think, going back to Jason's comment, very few bands I think are organic in the true sense. Going back to the 3 tiers I spoke about before, even if a band is talented and they have talented songwriters and they're very good musicians, the record label, which is all plugged into the controlling system, plugged into Tavistock and so on, it's going to be packaged in a way to ensure that the controller's agenda gets communicated out. So one way or another, if you're recording on a major label, you're plugged into the system whether you know it or not.
Yep.
And like Jason said, for the big bands, there's no question that they're in on the agenda from day one. That you just don't reach that level of fame and fortune and notoriety.
I think they're always going to need openers.
Yeah.
If you want to call them that, like they just need some extra bands.
Right.
So maybe they're not necessarily aware of what's going on, but it doesn't matter because they're still on these labels, or they're still with this management company, and they're going to get them somewhere. And all these things are still going to be done to them whether they know it or not.
Right. It's like what what Crrow said before. We're talking about the sigils, right? So let's just say a band puts out a record let's just say hypothetically, it's organic. They wrote all their own stuff. They're great musicians and all. And then the record company puts the record out, and the front cover is a gigantic pyramid. Right? I think of the Earth, Wind, and Fire album covers as an example. It was just loaded up with all kinds of Illuminati, Egyptian mystery symbolism. That's how they do it. It's not always the band members, like you said, Jason, being completely awake and aware of it. They may not be at all, but the controllers, the labels, like I said, they're a big piece of this agenda. They're going to make sure that there's going to be some piece of their agenda that's going to be communicated out, especially visually, because people love the visual aspects of it, right? So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there.
I'll mention one more thing about Prince before we move on to further the example that we're putting forth for people to consider. Think about how he became famous, right? It's like, let's think of, how about Fiddler on the Roof, right? You may have no interest in Hebrew history or religion or anything, but there's no arguing with the music of that movie, right? They knew when they went to go put that together that they had music that was going to do what music does. I would suggest to you that the Purple Rain album was that, but what did they do? They ponied up for a picture, right? A film at the same time. So as they broke this big album, which exploded at the time, it was put everywhere by the movie that accompanied it. And in the movie, other people that probably would have been mostly unknown also were buoyed up. The girl Vanity, or maybe Morris Day in the time, but I don't know too much about that band actually. But I'm just pointing out that it has every appearance that someone somewhere greenlighted this. The funds were made available and the machine went to work. They knew they had the music, because there's no arguing with the music. Either it's good music or it's not. And they had the film to go with it. And I always equate that to things like the popularity of the movie I mentioned. It's really the soundtracks that have done all the work there. But that's maybe enough of Prince. Tried to make the point. Let's move on. What is worship? And I think that the movie, or the HBO special that you brought up called American Gods, went a long way to demonstrating what worship actually is. What's a good example? So in society, a guy who's fallen madly in love with a girl, and you say to that guy, well, you worship her. Well, what are you saying to him? Why would you use those words? Well, because that's all he thinks about, right? His whole life is concentrating on this new love of his life. But what is it actually? And if you watch American Gods, you'll get a good idea. But let me ask you something. If you're a person who holds your cell phone for, let's say, 8 hours a day doing one thing or another, could that be considered worship? I'll open it up. What do you think, Mike?
It's conditioning. It's brainwashing at the very least. You've been conditioned to hold that phone, bring it with you everywhere, look at it, even aimlessly. In other words, you are bored, as an example, and you're just going to scroll through your phone and all that stuff. But you're worshiping the technology. Maybe I should say it that way.
I like it.
Right? So you're brainwashed and conditioned to being connected to that phone. There's no reason to be connected to it, folks. That's the thing you have to understand. Because years ago, when you didn't have these phones to take around with you, it was actually connected to the wall in your house. Life was okay. You got along just fine. If somebody called you, it went into the message machine or whatever, and then you got back to them when you were able to, and things were, like I said, they were fine. But the worshiping piece of it, it's the
How about the game Tetris? They're about to put a movie out on Tetris.
Yes.
Can you imagine if someone came up with a way to know how many hours in the world had been spent on the game Tetris? I would argue that that's a form of worship.
Yes. You're worshiping the technology. That's what you're doing. You're dedicating enormous amounts of time of your life doing that versus something else, something more productive, more creative, more imaginative. So that's what I said before about them stealing from you or removing from you your focus and your concentration, your consciousness. That's how it works. So you're going to tell me that you can't think of anything better to do in your life than to stare at your phone 6 to 8 hours a day? And if you answer, well, that's what I like to do, then you're a lost soul. I'm sorry.
Consider traditional worship. This is how I got there. when I lived in Newport, Rhode Island years ago, in 99, I had moved in there. There was a Baptist church, and I was always so impressed with how into it they were. They would go there dressed to the nines. Everybody in there dressed to the nines. They wouldn't just go for their hour, hour and a half. They were there from 7, 8 in the morning, well into the afternoon. You could hear the music. They brought food. They were serious about their church experience, and I always admired them. And it was primarily people of color, by the way, a Baptist church in Newport, Rhode Island. But my point is, think of how we typically would worship. So in where I grew up, Sunday was supposed to be the day of worship. Now, until I was 14 years old, my mother held up her end of the bargain that she agreed to when I was adopted by my parents, that I was to be raised Lutheran. And she did not drop the ball. She did raise me Lutheran. She took me and my brother every Sunday. As we got older, she had to bribe us. But our idea of worship was you drove in on a Sunday. I think all told, it might have been an hour, probably closer to 45 minutes actually in the sermon there, where what are we doing? We're worshiping. Well, what does that mean? It means we're paying attention. We're dedicating our energy and our focus to biblical concerns. That's our worship. And then I started to imagine gaming as an example. Can you imagine if you took the hours of a lifetime the average young person has put into gaming and had translated that to some other endeavor in the world, how much they could have got accomplished? And I think that's really what we're looking at here, is they realized with the technology, they could get, even if you want to call it something other than worship, I kind of think it is worship. You could really consume a significant portion of life. Like if you consider I'm awake for 2/3 of the day and asleep for 1/3 of the day, they could put you back to sleep for another third of the day on average. I'm just saying. I mean, what do you think, Jason?
Worship is such an odd thing, and I see so many people getting wrapped up in, I don't think they're living life, let's put it that way. I think that there's so much more to life than most people realize, and by getting wrapped up in something as stupid as a phone, I remember the 90s before all these phone things kicked off, and we did get along just fine. Now, I did know people with pagers, but that's beside the point. And life was fine, and we'd actually go out and spend time together. I sometimes make fun of this when I go into a coffee shop, for instance, that, hey, do something crazy like actually talk to the person next to you instead of staring at an electronic device.
And they act all insulted when you say hi.
Yeah, people look at me funny like, what?
Yeah, so many lost people with that stuff, with the technology.
I just think it's consciously, the more I learned about AI when we covered it, I became, it all started before I read the book by Shoshana Zuboff, which was a big old 4-inch thick book, which the first real book that I knew about written on AI. And that's what opened the door, because I'd already been looking at the wisdom of the crowd and the law of large numbers. And what I began to realize is what they're doing here is these programs estimate you've got this many million seconds in your life. How do we get them all? And that's how I began to realize that all the search returns are, based on your worship. You're interested in whatever you are. They then put a hook in that. Oh, here's a link for that girlfriend you knew in 7th grade. Oh, here's a link. I know your hobby is this. And what they do is they try to get every second. And to me, that is a form of worship, to grab a human being's attention for these extended periods of time. But if neither of you have more to add on that, I've got a place I want to go that I think is pretty important. Well, before we came back on the air, we were talking about how people in this part of the world were being fooled so easily back in the 80s and even the 90s. And part of it, in my view, was due to having been brought up and taught to think linear. Even time is linear. Nothing is cyclical in the way we were taught. Very, very few things are cyclical. And so what would happen, which is well demonstrated in the show American Gods, is we see a new name and a new costume, and so we automatically assume that's a new person. As a matter of fact, and I know people will go back and watch this, which I think is actually useful for a rare change. There's so much packed in there. What it deftly did is show this guy Odin. He's also Wednesday. He's also Wotan. He's 50 people. And A good example that they do is with Easter, the goddess that plays Easter. And what it demonstrates is what I think the sun originally taught people. And this is what shows up in the devil's pulpit, that we couldn't crack the code because of the way we think. What it basically shows is if you look at the sun in, let's say, June, it is not the same thing as the sun in September. Fall is occurring, but it is. It's the same actor, if you want to use that. It's just put on a different name and a different costume. So I truly think that the sun is what taught actors to start acting. And what goes on is a single actor changes an appearance, a costume, a name, and that's where we get lost. We think now that's a new personage altogether, when in fact it's not. And I think that's key. I mean, what do you think, Mike?
Well, it's basically something that we see today, even in pop culture, where it's a remake of a person, it's a remake of a movie, it's a remake of a song. You know, they just dress it up differently. But at its core, if you go back to the original version of it, you know, there is an original. And, but people don't think in terms of going back to the very beginnings of anything or to do the research to do that. And what they do is they just grab onto whatever comes to their attention or whatever is in their awareness at the moment. And that becomes a defining moment. That becomes definitive to them. So they don't spend any time comparing. They don't understand when we talk about gods as an example that it's ubiquitous across many different times during history, different cultures and different eras and different ages, that many of these gods are, they're the same God. It's just that they were given a different name and they were maybe dressed a little differently, and maybe a couple of attributes and characteristics were changed here and there to make, you know, so that it didn't map exactly to a previous God. But, you know, it's, your point, I guess, Crow, is that it all does go back to a central source or a beginning where that's the foundation. And from there, it kind of takes on a life of its own as we go through different periods in time. People in general don't have the bandwidth to research this stuff and to really understand it. So whatever it is that's presented to them at right now is what it is that they believe it is and what it is that they accept.
You know, the other thing is the refashioning, and that's the last thing I'll say about American gods, but the idea of media, the word that we use as media and all recognize, they track that back to an original kind of Greeky, gaudy sense. But so let's switch back over to music. Do you two still have bands that you respect as somehow free and clear of the things we've been talking about? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a good question. So I'll give you my answer. Not really. And, because the work that I've done looking into the Beatles and the music industry, but especially the Beatles, because, you know, they're basic. When I talk about foundational types of things, they are foundational to the music industry. So what I have done is to move more toward independent artists, Crrow and Jason. So as an example, back in 2021, I released the great indie playlist. So I have a lot of musicians and artists, some producers that subscribe to my YouTube channel, especially my Beatles channel. And I had them submit their songs. And so one song per artist, and it had to be an original, no covers. And I did the same thing a couple of months ago for 2023. What you find is that there is a tremendous amount of talent out there that is organic, and it's not tainted by the agenda of the controllers or the record labels and the producers and all that stuff. So my quick answer is that there are very few bands that I used to listen to all the time when I was growing up that I look at today and say, yeah, you know, they were organic or they were not tainted or touched by the system, because it's not true. I know it's not true. I know in one way or another, they have been touched and tainted and contaminated by the controller's agenda. So I lean today far more toward indie music. That's my answer. A long way of saying it, but that's where I've landed.
I think what you just said is critically important. But what about you, Jason?
Knowing what I know, I just assume that any major band that I may have come into contact with throughout my life has some sort of manipulation to them, but some more so than others. I know you and I have had this discussion. I don't see Pink Floyd, for instance, who I really like, having been anywhere near as much of a manipulation tool as, say, the Beatles. Just too many problems surrounded the band. Sid Barrett was a casualty of the psychedelic era, compounding his own mental problems that seemed to already be there, that kind of thing. Not saying that they weren't being used for things, because they certainly were helping to push the psychedelic narrative in the late 60s and go get drugged out. Drug use, yeah. But even the way they fought later and all that, it just seems like that they weren't quite the tool for manipulation that other bands were. But on the other hand, I completely accept the fact that maybe they were. And I don't care. I appreciate the music for what it is, and I logically detach myself from that aspect of it. It's like, okay, well, I know what the music business is. I know what the entertainment industry as a whole is. Can I still appreciate Dark Side of the Moon for being an incredible album? Of course I can.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jason. I'm in the same boat. I can still go back and listen to these songs and appreciate the musicianship, the songwriting, the craftsmanship behind the songs, but I listen to it with a discerning ear, knowing what I know. So I can still go back and listen to Beatles songs and say, you know, that's a really good song, because you know why? Because it's a really good song. You know?
Plus the nostalgia of it, right? You were young. That's going to draw you back. And the other part of it is we're freaking starving out here for some decent music. So many, even the young people now are going back to, I think predominantly 70s and 80s rock has caught on with a younger generation. Now I see it all over, bands propping up that are doing Zeppelin. But as far as Pink Floyd, I did the same thing, Jason. I thought, come on, David Gilmour, there's never going to be a time you convince me that someone else bumped him out of a studio to do his guitar part. He's that good. You know he's that good. Not only is he that good, that sound is unique all the way through. There's no breaks where you'd be wondering, is that really, did Gilmour write that lead? It's a Gilmour lead. You can hear it. But here's what I began to notice, because I didn't want it to be true anymore. And of all the bands that I still do listen to, Pink Floyd is among them. I acknowledge a lot of it's nostalgia. I acknowledge that it's because I'm suffering for a freaking key change around here. But there was a concert when Prince died where Gilmour did Purple Rain. Ding, 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 ding. And guess what? Guess who came up on the stage? Crosby, Stills. You know, it's all the world's a stage. And to be at that level, I don't think you're independent. And how do we begin to address things like how many hundreds of weeks was Dark Side of the Moon at the top of the pops? I mean, I think that means something. So I went through this too. And one of the bands I tried to do it with is Rush, right? So of all the bands I could think of, I thought the stories that I had heard of them and what I think I know of them, they seem to be the least kind of mainstreamy in my mind for some reason. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. The story with Rush is they were about to be dropped by their label. So they said, F you, went off and created 2112 because they could. Whether that's believable or not, I don't know. When your record label's getting ready to dump you and they expect an album. And so they risked it all and they put 2112. And at first, nobody cared. And lo and behold, some DJ in Chicago or somewhere started playing it. Lordy be, it caught on like wildfire. From that day forward, no one ever said boo to Rush again. They wrote their old ticket. And I'm just saying, are any of these things possible? Or is the real truth that when you get up to a level, you're going to play ball? But that does not address the initial thing that we asked. Is it possible to be Rush if you're just a kid, random kid in high school who wants to be in a rock band? Is that possible? And so, and for me, we've answered. I love Mike's response for the following reason. I started to have a real love-hate relationship with the music I grew up with because I was so pissed off that I knew I'd been a tool. I knew I'd been programmed by the very thing that I loved and learned how to play and basically worshiped, if you want to be honest about it. And so I started listening to other kinds of music. As you know, Jason, I got mandolins and other things. And I did what Mike did. I went indie. And what I started to do was, in my view, mandolins are really hard to play. So I started really admiring people that I could find that could shred on a mandolin. I thought that's some pretty serious skill. Those things are very difficult to play. And that led me into different genres. And basically it led me back around to classic music. And the reason for that is because of its complexity. And what I noticed is when I first went back to classic, I could really only sit down and listen to the ones we all know. Clair de Lune, Beethoven's Fifth. I mean, you know them, all the ones that were on Bugs Bunny. And eventually you start to recognize how diverse and how eclectic and how higher minded the music is. And that's what led me in. But I saw your list, Mike, and I admired that you did that because I knew why you did it. And I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say before we move off this topic is, even when bands argue with each other, we have to understand that, especially with a lot of these large bands, they're Freemasons. They're in the Masonic structure. And the Masonic structure is a corporate structure. It operates the exact same way. And so they are made, opportunities are made available to them, but they still have to vie for position. They still have to compete within the Masonic system to move up the ladder or to become successful. The thing is, because they are Freemasons and they're in secret societies, they have the opportunity to do that. They have the opportunity to at least compete, whereas you and I do not. We are outside that pyramid. So we're not going to see those opportunities, and we're not even going to be able to have the opportunity to debate or fight with each other as band members and split bands up and regroup and do this and do that because we're not in the club. So it's not one of these things where it's always smooth sailing for these bands and these band members and these artists. They're humans, after all. I mean, they are. I mean, they have a different philosophy than we do, but they still have human emotions like anger and stuff like that. So when I take a look at some of these bands and these stories about them breaking up and who hates who and who's fighting with who, and then they get back together again to reunite and so on. I mean, I look at it as, well, okay, but at least you have the opportunity to do that. Whereas somebody like myself, you, Jason, you, Crow, or any number of folks who are listening to this right now who are musicians and artists, in bands, you're not going to have that opportunity. You're just not.
No, there's no backing system of fight to fight. But I think I can underscore what you're saying with the character of Kramer. Does everyone remember Kramer from Seinfeld?
Yeah.
I will remind people that in the 90s, there was nothing bigger on television for a period of time than Seinfeld. I've mentioned many times that in San Diego, and this is in the 90s, the street was empty everywhere in San Diego. I think it was a Thursday night, if I remember correctly, the last episode of Seinfeld, which was a two-parter. But Kramer went out to be a comedian, and if I'm not mistaken, I'm doing this from memory, he was filmed calling a black man a nigger or something like that.
Yes.
That went viral. If I further am not misremembering, he made it to the cover of Masonic Monthly magazine shortly after that. Does anyone else remember what I'm saying?
I remember the situation. I remember him making the comment he made on stage, but I don't recall the Masonic magazine cover.
I'm going to look it up real quick because it's a big deal. Maybe if Rose is listening, she can. Yeah, there it is. It's on Scottish Rite. He's on the cover of Scottish Rite, September 2000. Maybe if Rose has a minute, she can tell me if I've remembered correctly that he made this album cover after he was filmed in a nightclub using a derogatory term. Now, we should also remember that to use the word nigger back then was not as outlawed as it is now. It was catching up. It was about to be. But the way I remember it is that he was filmed racially slurring a black man that had heckled him. And then shortly after, he was put on the Scottish Rite magazine cover, which would lead me to believe that he was directed to do what he did. Yeah,
a lot of that stuff is scripted, Crow. Folks don't want to really believe that. There's a tremendous amount of scripting that goes on.
Is it common for people of color to be Masons? Does anyone know?
Yeah.
It is?
They have their own Masonic lodges, yes.
Yeah, the Prince Hall Masons.
So wait a minute, they're segregated? Like there's a black Mason is not with a white Mason?
Yes and no. Up until a few decades ago, Absolutely. It was segregated. The Prince Hall Masons were for black folks. That was it.
Really?
They've had to get over that, to put it bluntly. So black people can now be in the regular lodges, but you still don't see it very much.
Yeah, I as I thought about it, I began to think, wait a minute, I don't think I've ever seen an African American associated with Masonry in the way that I've seen so many white people, which made me wondering. But we'll look it up. I'm sure someone will tell me if I remember correctly. Pretty sure it went filmed doing a racial slur. That goes all over the evening news, coast to coast, and we know what the media does. And then the magazine cover. I hope I don't have that backwards. But another good example, and we've got to touch on it. I mean, come on, even the name of the band, Queen. Everyone assumes that it was a sexual name, which is a little bit interesting because as far as I know, there was only one non-heterosexual Freddie Mercury in the band and the other three were. So doesn't it seem a little weird that you would name your band Queen on those terms? But let's pull it back to reality. Androgyny was huge when Queen took its name. But have you guys noticed that since Freddie's passing, Queen has been getting paid God knows how much money? Their music is in everything. It's on so many commercials, advertisements, in the movies. Have you guys noticed this?
Yeah, I've
Sure.
noticed that Queen is still front and center.
And he, if I'm not mistaken, the head of that band is an astrophysicist.
Brian May. Yeah,
is
Brian
he an
May.
astrophysicist?
Yes.
Right. But there is a definite connection to the royalty somehow. And who can forget him with his regal sounding guitar, which is another piece of this, because it really does have kind of a regal sound to it. Standing on, I think it was Buckingham Palace, right? Do you remember that? Brian May being filmed on the top of the palace playing whatever it was he played?
I think I might have missed that clip, but it doesn't surprise me.
Well, he's also been knighted.
Yeah, he's been knighted, but I think he might have been playing the national anthem or something. But I mean, how can you ever? Oh, there it is. She just wrote me back. So Kramer, whatever his real name is, I've forgotten. He made the N-word comment in 2006, and he makes the cover of Scottish Rite in 2003. So I did have it backwards, but it shows, right?
Yeah, now with Queen, Crow, I think it goes both ways. It points back to the crown, but also Freddie was like rock's version of Liberace. You know,
He really was.
it had two different meanings. One pointed back to the crown and back to the Queen, and the other one had to do with the agenda at that time when it really was hot and heavy with homosexuality.
Here's an interesting thing. Did you know that Freddie Mercury, I think, was supposedly trained as an illustrator or something like that in an art college, as so many of the British bands were? He's credited with designing the Queen logo. So you've got the phoenix there, but did you notice that the crab, which would be Cancer, which would show up on an astrological read in many usages at 12 o'clock, but many crabs have blue blood. So it's kind of encoded right into their logo, the blue blood connection.
Yeah, I know that he designed the logo. I didn't know about the art school bit of it, though.
Pretty sure he was an illustrator, if I remember correctly. But
No,
again,
I'm sure you're
correct
right.
me.
Yeah.
Not 100%. But that crab, when you look at it, and I think there was actually some versions of this with a pelican or something, but it's clearly a phoenix, and there's all so much occult meaning. The crown is dead center in the Q, and above that is the crab, and people wonder why it's there. Well, for one, it's the zodiacal sign. Remember when David Bowie, who was a Cancer, died? I think it happened in the sign of the crab, and his age was 69, which is the symbol for the sign of Cancer. But the thing about crabs is they're encoding the blue blood idea. So there's definitely a connection. But Queen always stuck out to me as completely insider baseball. And they went to some weird studios along the way to record too, by the way.
Yeah, no question. They were plugged into the pyramid. No question.
They're an example of a band that actually had significant talent, though. If you watch any behind the scenes of them in the studio, for instance, you'll see that those guys actually have what it takes. But obviously, we know that they're playing ball.
Well, that's interesting too, because the one member, John Deacon, seemed to have distanced out. But what's interesting, and I wasn't aware of it, he apparently still manages in some capacity, either the money or the actual management. But he left the stage part of it. I thought maybe he was furthering himself. But while we've still got time, let's bring up an interesting one. Cat Stevens. Don't you guys think that is so interesting, what happened with him? He was at the top of his game. He could have sold out arenas anywhere. And he walked away and decided to become full-time Muslim, learn the language, did everything. As the story goes, I think was apparently told that it wasn't very Muslim-like to be a rock star, so he quit singing for a period of time. That since stopped. But isn't it interesting to see someone walk away from the highest heights of fame and fortune in that manner? And the way he did it distanced, all the way out of the culture, right? All the way from Western top of the pops to other side of the world, speaking a new language.
I remember when he made the switch, because I used to like a lot of Cat Stevens' songs.
So did I.
I was a very good guitar player. But when he turned to Islam, at the time I thought, why did he do that? But now that I think about it, Crow, I think to myself, well, maybe it was a way to call attention to Islam, considering what was going to be on the radar in the future. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but it was peculiar when it happened, no question.
I saw a concert, and I'm trying to remember that it's the last concert he did. I don't know if it's true. I would have to look, but he's singing Father and Son, the famous song Father and Son, where he basically says, I have to go. It's right in the lyrics. I think I remember him wearing the garb of the Middle East, whatever you call the white, long, flowy robes, which actually there's a spiritual reason for reading. Anyone who's read The Light of Egypt knows that it's not spiritually inclining to wear tight things like socks, shoes, and belts and such, bras. That's supposed to be counterfeit. But I think it's a good example, and maybe I'll look into it at some point, how he was he literally was an A-list rocker, right? And it was mostly just him, usually accompanied with maybe a drummer, another guitar, not a lot of people. And it was him. He was front and center. And when he walked away, he walked all the way away. It's just interesting. It makes me wonder, is that what it takes to get out from under whatever you're doing? Pull the religion card saying, I'm going back to God. And, go ahead, Jason.
He was at the top of his game, so you got to wonder, did he see things or have to be involved in things that maybe he didn't like very much?
I think it's interesting, too, that it had to do with religion, right? Because if everything we've said about Law is true, then maybe he didn't even own his own name. When he goes out on the stage now, they use Cat as kind of a byline, but now he's Yusuf Islam, right? That is the name that's usually portrayed. And then they remind people that he was Cat Stevens. So is this an absolute stamp of authority of someone going back to the highest source to get out from under the dark cloud that their name has tied them up with? I don't know. I'm speculating.
Yeah, like I said, I can't discount that it wasn't scripted as well,
Yeah, you can't prove a negative and you can't prove this for certain, but at some level you can, because it becomes overwhelming. But at this point, I'll say where I am at this point for folks. I'm actually putting a room by room audio system in, and it's not a big deal. It's just some speakers in each room. The reason that I've decided to do this is because I am very sensitive to frequencies. And so I will bathe my home and try to imprint my home with what I feel are positive frequencies when I'm about 2 miles away from a almost 400-foot cell tower, 2 miles away. And I think at night I can hear it. I've imprinted my room. But nonetheless, will I go back to the music of my youth? And the answer to that is yes. Occasionally I will listen to those things now. Maybe I don't listen in the same way. And to be honest, maybe now I listen for the talent more than I used to. But I also know that what's happened to me is I will also listen to bluegrass. I will also listen to classical. In other words, my genres have blown open, where I used to be pretty particularly a rock and roll kind of guy from a pretty specific period of time, although I was also a punk rocker. So where are you guys? Knowing what we know now, how do you treat the music that we grew up loving? Mike?
I still love a lot of it, Crow. But like I said earlier, I'm discerning now when I listen to it. The luster, as far as believing that the artists or the band members that were involved were actually on the recordings and actually wrote the music, a lot of that is gone. With the Beatles, it's completely gone. So what now it's down to I can have an appreciation for the songwriting. I can have an appreciation for the arrangement and the production. A good song is a good song. That's how I look at it. But I don't spend a lot of time these days listening to what I used to listen to when I was younger because of what I know and the work that I've done. So I do go back to the indie types of music. So you can hear a lot of it on Reverb Nation and SoundCloud and so on. And there's a lot of talent out there. There's a lot of really, really good musicians and songwriters and singers that will never see the light of day because of the way the system works. But my view is that's who I'm going to support going forward. So the quick answer is I still listen to some of the stuff I used to listen to, but I've weaned myself off it for the most part.
So I'm going to get how Jason has found his balance. But one of the things I really love is the people who are maybe in their 20s going back to Zeppelin and playing that in their bands. I really enjoy that because it's different. It's not straight off the album. It's people who love the music for the reason they do. But I just like hearing the skill level of the younger people covering those. But Jason, how do you find your balance knowing everything that we know now?
Well, a lot of what I listen to these days, as far as the mainstream stuff, I'm listening to it to understand production because I'm so into the gear, the studio, sounds, layering, all that kind of thing. I love listening to it and trying to figure out, okay, so how did they do that? That sounds amazing. How did this technique come up and how can I replicate that? Or how could I take that and apply it to the music that I write?
Do you feel like you spend as much time, like when I was younger in a given year, there would have been a lot of Zeppelin, a lot of Floyd hours, a lot of basically just what's come to be called classic rock, along with certain bands from the punk rock genre. For me, it's lessened. I'm a bit like Mike. Now I've become much more eclectic. And by the way, I have a growing interest in classical music for the simple reason that I'm really interested in unique talent. Like I can go on YouTube and find guitarists that can probably play faster than Yngwie Malmsteen. They're out there, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in a musical skill level that's not a carbon copy, that's not just the 12-bar blues over and over and over again. And in that, it led me to classical to recognize how complex 18 to 20 different instruments put together is. And I'm finding real enjoyment. And also in bluegrass, I find a lot of very good musicians in bluegrass that is different than the rock. But I find myself listening to less than I used to before I knew everything I knew. So, Mike, what do you have on the horizon? What are you going to be up to?
Well, I have a new presentation out, which is called The Addendum. Did the Beatles write all their own music? And I really do believe that it definitively closes the case on whether the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all of their recorded tracks. So if you go to my Hub website, you can hit that video. It's about 2 hours and 45 minutes long. It picks up where my original presentation left off. So the original was back in April of 2020. So I just released this one this month. And right now, what's going on is I am working on releasing a third album. So I'm actually in the middle right now of finishing the 10th song for the album. The album's going to have 10 songs. So a lot of my focus has gone to that. And I'm going to give the Beatles stuff a break because I really am Beatled out with this stuff. And I really am. I'm going at it now for 7 years. And, it gets to the point where it's diminishing returns. And once you feel like you've made your case, So that's where I'm at right now. I'm going to spend a lot of time with my wife. We have a grandson. He's 8 months old. So
congratulations. That's a big deal. Good for you.
It is a big deal. We love it. And so we're going to just, sit back and enjoy the more simple pleasures in life. And it's not to say I won't hop into certain things when I need to, but you also need a time out, take a break, relax, recharge. You've got to do that. You can't be consumed with this stuff because it's a big, murky whirlpool of stuff, and I don't want to spend my time there all the time.
Well, at some point, whoever, quote unquote, Paul McCartney is, and not that I wish ill on anyone, but he's not going to be here forever, especially if he's 5 years older than he claims to be. I'm sure there's going to be things for you to look at all over again because that's going to change a lot, I think.
Well, I was told by a source of mine, a friend of mine, who occasionally hobnobs with the beautiful people, that he has some health issues as we speak.
Well,
Yeah,
anyone who's in the approximate 80 age, you're really not in the pinnacle of health anymore, are you?
right. No, things happen when you get older. I can vouch for that.
So I mean, yeah, I can vouch for that. Um, I'm lucky to have met some of the people I met, or things would be very different for me right now. But the music business is called the music business for a reason. It's just that most of us don't realize the importance of entertainment and that it's not just a business. It's also co-opted as a culture creation tool, as a dumbing down tool, as it's been used. In my lifetime, what popular music has done is fallen. It's plummeted. The complexity, having people who call themselves musicians, who once upon a time knew music theory, knew genres of music, were very skilled at their instrument, to be employed as a musician, all that's out the window now. To be called a musician now, you could record things that have absolutely no melody, no musical theory, no nothing. And that will pass for music now. As I mentioned, we're about 30 years away from key changes. Of all things, the most basic thing in music, a key change being part of things. But Mike, let's close with this idea. You were pointing out 3 movies, which I think are helpful to people, to show them what was actually true of the music industry that built everything that music sits on now. One of them is called The Wrecking Crew. What's the name of the other?
Muscle Shoals.
Muscle Shoals. And what's the other one?
Hired Gun.
Hired Gun. So the Wrecking Crew in this country probably played as big a role as anyone we're aware of. But let's talk, because we can, for a few more minutes about Glenn Campbell. This is a key point. Glenn Campbell could not read music. If you asked me to point to a better guitar player in the world than Glenn Campbell, I don't think I could. Truly, I don't think I could. And he was part of the Wrecking Crew. But here's the difference. He was handsome as all get out. And he stepped out of the studio musician Wrecking Crew, who were writing or recording the music for all the biggest bands that were coming out of America, Lord knows where else, and he became famous in his own right. Isn't it interesting? And what do you suppose all those musicians, like there's Harry Nilsson is in a clip saying basically, I wrote Beatles music and I was never credited. There are other people in the Wrecking Crew who have come close or maybe even hinted that I wrote all this great music and never got anything for it other than a studio fee. And then we have Glenn Campbell, who was talented beyond belief, but he became famous in his own right. And when he made his albums, who did he hire? He hired the Wrecking Crew. Are you aware of all that, Mike?
Yeah. So, and the thing is, people bring up Glenn Campbell a lot, and they say, well, Glenn Campbell couldn't read music, so the Beatles couldn't read music. So if he couldn't read music and be an exceptional guitarist, why does that not apply to the Beatles? I mean, Glenn
because
Campbell,
they didn't film them. That's all you got to say. Glenn is on film everywhere, shredding with the best of them. There is no Beatle footage of that type.
Yeah, well, and Glenn was a virtuoso. I mean, there's no question about it. There's plenty of footage of Glenn Campbell playing his guitar, and he was just a magnificent guitar player. Now, not everybody who's a great musician reads music, but the great ones are great, and they can sit in with any group of musicians or a band, and they just adapt immediately, and they take the song where it needs to go. So that's what people have to understand. You can't take one person, a Glenn Campbell, and then say, well, that applies to all of these other people. It's just, it's a silly way to apply logic. It's case by case, and that's how you have to look at it.
There's footage of him at some point saying, I couldn't read music and that was going to be a problem, but I was good enough that I could always make it work, because what they do is usually they come in, they put the sheet music down in front of all the gunslingers, and they'll tell you, we're playing it exactly like this, or you have some latitude, whatever. He said, I couldn't do that. But luckily, I knew a few of the people there, and everybody knew I was good enough that I could make it work, even though I couldn't read the sheet music, which tells you another thing, that it is unusual for the best of the best at that period of time to not be formally trained and read music.
Well, and Jimmy Page was a session player going back to when he was 17 years old. And originally, Page couldn't read music. He had to teach himself to read music in order for him to be a session player going forward. So, it's having the ability to read music is very important if you're a session musician. Is every session player going to be able to read music? No, but the vast majority of them, yes. That's the business, like you said, Crow, they're going to put sheet music in front of them. You got to be able to read it.
It's crazy. And we're getting ready to close here, but when I was young, had someone suggested to me that Glenn Campbell could probably blow the doors off Jimmy Page and just sheer guitar shredding skill, I wouldn't have even considered it. But right now, if someone asked me who are some of the most talented musicians, it wouldn't even be in the rock genre. I mean, it would. There are a few, but like even people like Roy Clark, there were people on that cheesy Southern show, Hee Haw. There are a couple there that are among the best musicians you'll ever see, and they do it across multiple instruments. It's just crazy. And that's what I've begun to really admire is the skill level and to get away. But Jason, anything you want to add in? This is our big music episode.
Right. Well, country music is a different animal altogether. Nashville is still very much a cutthroat kind of, you better be damned good if you want to attempt to make something of yourself there.
I'll close with this conspiratorial idea. I have always suspected that there is some kind of a tie between the $6 million man, Lee Majors, and Glenn Campbell. Have either of you ever thought that?
No, that's a new one on me.
Put them next to each other. There's something going on. I already know there's something going on with Lee Majors. We've covered it before. I don't know whether he was a double agent or what, but there's something there. It's even covered in the movie Argo, which is really where the red bell got rang for me. But Mike, anything else you want to add before we tell folks where they can find you?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground, Crow and Jason. It was a very enjoyable show to sit in on and contribute to.
Part of the idea is funny is what we're basically saying is maybe the old Zen monk on top of the mountain was true. Just live in the minute, appreciate the music right in this minute and let the rest of it go. Don't worship the guitarist. Don't worship the album cover. Don't, just appreciate things in the minute. Maybe that helps you dodge some of the programming bullets. But in my mind, it took me a few years to get over the betrayal that I felt when I had to realize that I had absolutely been programmed by my own decision to like things. But with that, Mike, tell folks where they can find you.
My hub website, folks, sageofquay.com, SAGEOFQUAY. It's all there. My music's there. My work on the Beatles is there, and work in other areas. All of the links are on the website.
All right, Jason, anything you want to add in before I close up shop for today?
Mike, good on you for still making music and recording your own original stuff and putting it out there. Love it.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, man, you're skilled. I've heard your music and it's impressive. And that's another thing that's always gotten me. You look at someone like you, Mike, or even Jason, or someone like the conspiracy music guru. You guys have every bit of talent that would be required to be in 90% of the bands that get famous. And yet you're not. Why is that? And I think we kind of covered it. But that's it. I'm going to bring hour 2 of episode 496 to a close. And I'd like to wish everybody out there a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era. Cheers.